To start us off, a large dinosaur trackway was discovered in the UK within the Oxfordshire Quarry. This is the largest track site ever recorded in the UK, with it reaching a length of around 150 meters. The footprints that are identified here are sauropod and theropod footprints. Of course, the sauropod footprints, as you could probably guess, are absolutely massive, and the theropod footprints are thought to belong to Megalosaurus, or a very close relative. As far as what the footprints were doing, of course, that's not exactly clear. It does seem like the theropod footprints do overlap with the sauropod footprints, so they might have been following them, but we don't know exactly what was going on. It's still a huge and very exciting discovery. North America also discovered a new potential candidate for the oldest dinosaur to come from North America, or from Laurasia, really. The dinosaur in question is known as Avidum bonduvici. This little fella was uncovered in Wyoming back in 2013 and was finally described this year. It could reach an estimated length of around 3 feet and a height of 1 foot, which is smaller than Eoraptor, which is another basal sauropodomorph. Discoveries like this are always really cool because, for one, knowing some of the oldest dinosaurs to ever exist is always just very exciting. It's always very exciting. But I also really love finding basal sauropodomorphs because of how different they are from the later sauropods that we all know and love, like, Argentinosaurus and things like that. This guy was tiny. It was a tiny little dinosaur that was, in a way, sort of the precursor to the much larger behemoths that we're more familiar with. Always just very exciting stuff. To step away from dinosaurs for a little bit, there was a study published this year that looked to kind of answer the question on whether or not large ground sloths like Megatherium and Arematherium were hairy, or if they were more sparse with their hair. So for some context for this, giant ground sloths were huge. Like Megatherium and Arematherium were comparable in size to elephants. And elephants, as you probably know, don't have a lot of fur, and that's because elephants live in a warmer environment. Too much fur would probably be it really wouldn't be beneficial for a large animal like an elephant. So the question did remain, would giant ground sloths even need fur? Well, the study actually looked at the metabolism of giant ground sloths, and it found that they could certainly get away with it, especially the ones that lived in a cooler environment like Megatherium. Megatherium most likely did have fur, but it was also noted that an animal like Arematherium was probably still hairless, given the fact that it lived in a warmer environment. This is something that was showcased in Prehistoric Planet Ice Age, where we see this giant, hairless Arematherium. Again, Arematherium was in a more warm environment, so less fur would probably make sense for the animal, but Megatherium, there's a good chance that Megatherium was still pretty hairy. Next up is the discovery of Tamariaptor. This is probably one of the most fascinating discoveries of this month, or maybe even this year in general. And that's just because of how it was discovered. So Tamariaptor, its fossils were uncovered by Ernst Stromer and his team back in 1914. I'm sure that many of you heard the name Ernst Stromer and you automatically knew where this was going. Of course, he brought his fossils back, and eventually World War II began, and the museum that contained much of Stromer's collection was destroyed, along with these new fossils, the Spinosaurus fossils too, but these new fossils that we're talking about right now. Now, since then, those fossils were assigned to Carcharodontosaurus, a Carcharodontosaurid that lived in North Africa during the late Cretaceous. But recently, there was some analysis done on Stromer's description of those fossils and the photos that were taken of those fossils, and there was a different conclusion reached. These fossils are different from Carcharodontosaurus. They are distinct. They are still Carcharodontosaurids, but just a different one. This new animal has been named Tamariaptor markgraffi. Much like other Carcharodontosaurids, it probably had a fairly similar anatomy about it. It probably had a similar looking body, and overall its skull shape was likely decently similar. But one thing that helped it stand out was the fact that it had a very interesting nasal structure. That's one of those things that helped make this distinct from Carcharodontosaurus, is that Carcharodontosaurus doesn't have that. The structure might have looked like a horn, or maybe some sort of small crest on its nose, but either way, it was still very different from pretty much any other large Carcharodontosaurid that we know of. And if you ask me, it's really an exciting discovery. This fellow would have lived with other large dinosaurs like Spinosaurus, of course, much like Carcharodontosaurus did, but it really does stand out from the rest of the crowd. And then finally, at the very end of January, there was a paper published that was describing a brand new ornithomimid known as Mexadrachon longimanus. Now, this fella is so fascinating because of its hands. Now, okay, so first, some context behind this animal. It lived in the late Cretaceous of what is now Coahuila, Mexico, and it was discovered in the Cerro del Pueblo Formation. And it was just so unique because of its long hands. It had these long hands with, of course, decently long claws, which is very different from other types of ornithomimids that we're quite familiar with. In terms of its whole body plan, it was likely pretty similar to other ornithomimids, long neck, relatively small head, and probably covered in feathers. But it's also worth mentioning that it probably wasn't as speedy as other ornithomimids. It doesn't seem like its legs were quite built for that. So it's not as fast as other ornithomimids, and it has these long hands. Now, the hands were likely used to help scoop up vegetation and things like that. There's also been some art out there released that shows them kind of using them against fish, which is just really funny imagery and just, I don't know, it's very interesting stuff. And it's just a really amazing discovery, like a strange discovery in a family that's already kind of on the side of being a little bit strange. 2025 in general had so many fantastic discoveries. So be sure to check that stuff out because it is definitely going to be worth it.
I'm Dr. Diana King, a real-life micro-paleontologist, and I'm here to tell you about some of the coolest and most interesting paleontological studies and studies from related fields in February of 2025. The first paper that we're going to be talking about in this video is this one by Giovanni Mussi et al., which looks at intertidal mudflat sediments from the Middle Cambrian Pika Formation in Jasper National Park, Canada. This paper is really cool because at such an early stage in the evolution of complex animal life, we don't really have much in the way of an idea of what was living in intertidal sediments, only what was living in fully subaqueous habitats. Now, some Cambrian tidal deposits from elsewhere on Earth have found burrows in them that indicate that early arthropods or arthropod relatives, mollusks, preapulids, which are these worm things, which are still around now but nowhere near as common as they used to be, and some other kinds of worm were present and burrowing in these habitats. But our data was extremely limited. This paper describes intertidal shale sediments with desiccation cracks running through them due to their periodic drying out, which have a ton of different trace fossils and some body fossils in them. Of note, these sediments contain a number of U-shaped burrows from an unknown tracemaker and are full of tiny bits of poop from said tracemaker. Now, 17 of their samples contain a huge number of teeth from preapulomorphs. Now, preapulomorphs are a group of preapulids which are still around today, though apparently were much more common during the Cambrian, and some of the many teeth present were found to match two known genera which have been described from deeper water sediment, but most appear to represent a number of entirely undescribed new species. So this is really cool for giving us an idea of the high diversity of these weird funky worm things that were living in this habitat at the time. The scientists also found a bunch of these plate-like sclerites or scales from the weird spiky scaly animal Wiwaxia, which confirms that Wiwaxia was living in tidal habitats at the time. They also found a reasonably large number of chaetae, which are chitinous bristles found in a number of marine animals, including annelid worms, in particular polychaetes, and in the insides of brachiopods. They found that there were two distinct morphotypes of chaetae present, one of which very closely matched those found in a Middle Cambrian polychaete called Burgessochaeta, and the other has a bamboo-like texture, more similar to those seen inside brachiopods than which are seen in polychaete worms. So overall, this was a really cool study into the early intertidal mudflat animal communities at a time when, given the hostile atmosphere, it's kind of surprising to see any animals living in the tidal zone. And it's also interesting that so many of these animals seem to be in the same genera as deep water relatives. These authors suggest that the occurrence of Wiwaxia, Priapulomorphs, and potential stem group annelids in the Pica biota identifies a subset of what they call pioneer Burgess shale type metazoans capable of expanding into stressed, dysoxic, and at least intermittently subaerial environments, and point out that it's a pretty unique instance of members of both modern and classic Cambrian phyla being able to live and coexist with ecologically tolerant members of the other groups without outcompeting each other. The next study that we're going to be talking about comes from China and describes a new species of pterosaur in the genus Darwinopterus, described from this incredibly complete specimen by Jing Cheng and colleagues in this paper in the Annals of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences. This skeleton is named in honor of pterosaur paleontologist Diogenes de Almeida Campos, being named Darwinopterus camposi. The specimen comes from the Tiaojishan Formation of the Middle to Late Jurassic of Jianshan County in Liaoning, China, and was referred to the genus Darwinopterus on the basis of, and I'm just going to read this from the paper so I don't get anything wrong, the posterior region of the skull is elongated, and there's the presence of a bony premaxillary crest that starts around the anterior margin of the naso-antorbital fenestra. Darwinopterus camposi has a wingspan of around 75 centimeters, and based on its fused scapula, appears to have been an adult when it died. D. camposi had a number of features distinguishing it from other Darwinopterus species, including a straight upper margin of its crest, having a different number of teeth, that being 18 and 14 teeth on each side of the upper and lower jaws respectively, and the sides of the crest having a smooth texture. And the fourth phalanx on the wing finger is shorter than the first one, which is another distinctive feature of this new species. Now on to the next cool study of February 2025, and we're going to be talking about Delta 11b variability in Ammonia parkinsonia. So what the hell does any of what I just said mean? I'm going to try to explain this as simply as possible because I know that many of y'all are not paleoceanographers. So B refers to boron, which is a metal element which gets incorporated in very low amounts into the shells of calcifying organisms. An interesting feature about it is that, at least in deep water and open ocean settings, boron isotope ratios, that being the delta 11b, within calcifying organisms have repeatedly been shown to correlate very strongly with the pH of the seawater around those organisms. pH, for anyone who's not a chemistry nerd, is an inverse measure of the hydrogen ion concentration of a solution, whereby lower pH means that the water has more hydrogen ions and thus is more acidic. So low pH, more acidic, high pH, more alkaline, or more basic, more properly. This means that we can use foram shells, forams being a group of shelled single-celled organisms that I specialize in, as a proxy for past oceanic pH changes. This is where this exciting new study by Kyle Hardage comes in. You see, Hardage analysed a number of salinity and temperature proxies, as well as pH from ground and seawater at a site called Celestin Lagoon in Yucatan, Mexico, and looked at how a specific species of foram called Ammonia parkinsonia, which lives in intertidal habitats, was using these isotopes. They chose Ammonia parkinsonia because it's a common intertidal species that doesn't have any endosymbionts that might affect its internal pH and thus mess with their results. This lagoon is also a pretty useful site to analyse because it gets a lot of quite acidic groundwater due to local geology and soil types. Now, these guys did a ton of really cool and interesting statistics, and I mean a ton of it. This is a crazily dense paper with lots of new info in it. Like, Honestly, I would love to make a video just about this paper, but I feel like it would bore 90% of my audience to tears. But crucially, it seems that this proxy still works pretty well in these habitats and aligns fairly well with what the results were expected to be on the basis of their calculations, though the error is a bit wider than would be preferred, which is likely because of how much bioturbation happens in this habitat. But hey, you know what's nearly as exciting as forams? Lycophytes! What's a lycophyte, I hear you ask? Well, lycophytes are a group of small vascular plants that include spike mosses and club mosses. But despite being called mosses, they aren't actually mosses at all, or that closely related to them. They're more closely related to ferns than they are to mosses. Now, of all the lycophytes, if there's one genus you're really likely to come across in the world, wherever you are wandering around, it's Selaginella, which has over 700 described species. Here's some that I found, and some more that I found. Selaginella is so diverse because it has been around and been very successful for an extremely long time geologically, with specimens that are much like those present today being found in Carboniferous and potentially even Devonian-aged rocks. And in February 2025, a brand new extinct Selaginella spike moss was described from Miocene-aged amber from the Dominican Republic in this study by Ana Lopez Garcia and colleagues, filling in a gap in this genus's known fossil record, with Selaginella only being known from spores from the Oligocene and later Pliocene of the Greater Antilles. In fact, worldwide, we had no non-spore fossils of spike mosses from the Miocene, and now we have one, folks. This is Selaginella jurelliziae, from 15 to 20 million year old amber collected from Cordillera amber mines. This new spike moss can be distinguished from its relatives by all of these pointy serrated bits, and the fact that its leaves are ovate in shape. Now, because its vegetative shoots have leaf pairs with two different shapes and sizes of leaf relative to one another, the authors were able to confidently place it in a clade within Selaginella called the rhizophotic clade. But they weren't able to place it in a specific subgenus. They were only able to say that it's not in the genus Rupestrae because its leaves aren't helically arranged. That said, we do not know which modern Selaginella subgenus it would belong to, and thus who its closest relatives are, because all the bits that could be used to work that out are sadly not present in this fossil. So hey, a cool new fake moss. I wonder if any other unusual finds from Dominican amber also happen to be published in February. Oh hey, an extinct flea just got described as well. Now, unfortunately, I don't have direct access to this paper, but here's a grainy, low-res picture of the flea, which comes from the journal's cover. Its name was Pulicophoenix succinus, and it was described in this paper from the Annals of the Carnegie Museum by Robert Traub as a new species and genus of flea from 25 to 40 million year old Miocene amber. This flea had a number of diagnostic traits indicating it belongs to a subset of bird fleas who start life preambulatory, meaning that they have to actively seek out and find a host. This study apparently finds a number of instances of convergent evolution between South American and African flea lineages, and the author notes at the end it's entirely plausible that this genus might actually still be alive today because so little is actually known about South American and Caribbean fleas, because so little research has been done into them. So there's a great research project for someone in the audience if you're interested. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get direct access to this paper to talk about it more in depth. And now for something much much cuter than a flea, and what many people considered to be the most exciting paper to come out of February 2025, the discovery and description of an early fossil bird from the late Jurassic Nanwan Formation of China. This new bird was named Baminornis zhengensis in this paper by Runshen Chen and colleagues. The name is a mixture of Mandarin and Ancient Greek, meaning 8-min bird from Zhenghe. 8-min, by the way, is a historical name for Fujian. The fossil was described as being an exceptionally important transitional fossil in our understanding of bird evolution because it is the oldest known bird to have a pygostyle, which is a compound bone at the end of the tail instead of having a long lizard-like tail, whilst still having lizard-like hands. This paper also discusses a furcula or wishbone which was found at the same locality, which shows derived traits that can be referred to a derived clade, that being the ornithomimid, which is the group that includes all modern birds, but not the most common bird group throughout the Mesozoic, the enantiornithines, or opposite bird. This tells us that birds diversified and picked up a lot of their modern defining traits much earlier in their evolutionary history than we previously thought. It's an all-round incredible study and an incredible fossil, though I'm aware that whether or not what was described as a pygostyle in this paper actually is one has subsequently been disputed. But those studies that dispute this finding happened after February, so hopefully someone later in this crossover event will talk about them. Have you experienced a growth spurt? Are you a medium-sized theropod dinosaur with the most death metal face imaginable? Well, chances are that you're a Ceratosaurus nasicornis, possibly the coolest looking dinosaur of all time, which was the subject of this study by Riley Sombathy et al. In the Journal of Anatomy. And what they found about the growth rates of Ceratosaurus was insane. Now, the authors used thin sections of hind limbs, dorsal ribs, and an osteoderm from 4 Ceratosaurus individuals and searched them for lines of arrested growth, that being lines where an animal grows more slowly in winter due to a seasonal reduction in food availability, and which has been widely used in paleontological research to determine the growth rates and ages of the animals that they are researching. And these researchers consistently found in all of these bones that there were not many lines of arrested growth before the animal reached almost full size. Like, not many at all. They used 6 different growth model programs to assess what they found and what this meant, and all of their results consistently found that Ceratosaurus grew really fast. When they compared their results to other ceratosaur species, such as Machikosaurus and Majungasaurus, Ceratosaurus grew on average 9 times faster, and their period of accelerated growth lasted on average for only 1 or 2 years, meaning that these guys reached pretty much full size by the time they were between 1 and 2 years old.
Oh, look at the little baby. And now look at the big baby. Wow.
That is around a ton of mass in a year. If humans grew that fast, I shudder to think how much money parents would be spending on baby clothes. And frankly, to me at least, this actually kind of makes sense that in an environment where you have so many other species of theropod, in particular large ones like Allosaurus and Torvosaurus, that evolution might select for a fast growth rate so that you're bigger and harder to eat and it's easier to fight back much earlier in life, so you're able to pass on your genes earlier as a result. Like, it makes sense to me, but it's nonetheless absolutely astounding. And if time travelers ever come home with a baby Ceratosaurus and ask you to look after it, you now know that you won't be able to keep it indoors for very long at all. The final study that we're going to talk about today is by James Jenks et al. And was published in the Bulletin of the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. And this is my favourite study of the month. Yes, I saved my personal favourite one for last. Why is this one so lovely to me? Because ammonoids and nautiloids. This study looks at Induan-age sediments, that being sediments from the very earliest Triassic, from 2 sites, one of which was not previously known about prior to this study. And these sites were in the Thames Group at Crittenden Springs, Elko County, Nevada, in America, where the authors describe a ton of ammonoids and nautiloids being present. This study makes a ton of biostratigraphic discoveries, including the first specimens from the genus Gyronites, which have been found outside the Tethys and South Primorye seas. And the overall cephalopod assemblages from these sites correlate pretty well with ones in Pakistan and China. This study not only tells us which ammonoids and nautiloids were present at the site, but also provides really valuable taxonomic descriptions that effectively act as an identification guide for further researchers. What's even more exciting is that these authors discovered a new species of nautiloid. That's this adorable fella here, which is called Jauhenautilus chatelainii. They named this in honour of Edward Chatelain. I do not know who Edward Chatelain is. I'm assuming that this is just a friend of the author's, since I can't find anything about him being a paleontologist. And look how cute this new little nautilus is. It's adorable. So, February was overall a pretty great month for paleontology, and this isn't even all the papers I was planning to talk about. I just realised that my script was 13 pages long. There's also some really important and impressive paleoclimate research, like this study, which found evidence for a poleward shift in the Asian monsoons during the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And there was this study, which described a new species of Cretaceous dragonfly from the J-hole biota of Yaoning, China, in the form of this beautifully preserved partial wing. This was a genuinely great month, and frankly, I think I got the best one. Okay, I didn't, I lied. The best month was definitely November because of Bruce Hayward's huge Elphidian taxonomy monograph, but come on, if I got November, I would have just made an hours-long video just talking about the Elphidid taxonomy monograph and completely forgetting about anything else that came out this month. So from your perspective, me not picking November was a blessing in disguise. Thank you very much for watching.
Starting off with the new creatures of the month, a study by Federico Agnolin and colleagues described a new late Cretaceous ecosystem in Patagonia's Anacleto Formation, which included the naming of a new titanosaur species, Chadotitan calvoi, based on several partial skeletons. Despite the memes, which the authors clearly knew were coming, the name of this relatively small 7-meter sauropod comes from the indigenous Mapudungun word for salt, in reference to a vast nearby salt flat. 2 new Middle Jurassic ornithischians were described from rocks in Scotland and Morocco this month. Both are pretty fragmentary, so neither author team could justify naming them, but the Scottish one described by Elsa Pansiroli et al. Represents Scotland's first partial dinosaur skeleton, while the Moroccan partial femur from Susanna Maidment et al. Is now the oldest known sauropod, the family that contains ornithopods like hadrosaurs and the bony or horn-headed marginocephalians like Pachycephalosaurus and Triceratops. Khalid Mahmoud and colleagues described 3 pieces of otter jaws from Miocene to Pliocene-aged rocks in Pakistan, each belonging to a new species. The new one they described is between 5.5 to 7 million years old and was named Sivaonyx bathinathus. They also describe a tooth from Enhydriodon, the lion-sized otter genus, which would probably be a household name right now if the suits at Apple TV weren't afraid of people actually learning things from their documentaries. Probably the biggest headline grabber of the month was the 2-fingered Mongolian therizinosaur from the late Cretaceous Bayan-Shiri Formation described by Yoshitsugu Kobayashi and co., which they named Duonychus tsogbatari. Aside from making therizinosaurs the 4th example of theropods going double digits, a particularly cool part about the fossil is that one of the left-hand fingers preserves a nearly complete keratinous sheath, showing just how long these branch hooks were in life. Leaving the realm of vertebrates, The next newly named creature comes from South African rocks that date to the late Ordovician some 445-ish million years ago. Sarah Gabbett and colleagues described 2 fossils of this animal, which they named Curbos susanae, and identified it as part of the euarthropod group. Interestingly, the fossils at this site, called the Sum shale, are preserved in such a way that the 3-dimensional structure of the internal anatomy is readily visible, and sometimes better preserved than the hard exoskeleton, so the authors were able to go fairly in-depth in describing these sea creatures' squishier parts, like the muscles and tendons. Moving forward to another arthropod discovery, Chong Wu and colleagues described and named a new species of late Cretaceous wasp from the, let's say, controversial amber mines of Myanmar, though the authors state that these fossils were purchased in 2015 during a relative lull in the ongoing catching conflict that has posed an ethical problem for paleontologists. Unfortunately, like many of the creatures found in these amber fossils, the wasp itself is very interesting. Named Sirenobethylus charybdis, all 16 individuals display a strange multi-part grasping structure at the end of their abdomens around their ovipositor that was triggered by sensitive hairs, similar to a Venus flytrap. Not only does this tell us that these wasps were all female, but the authors suspect that this abdominal apparatus was used to grasp other insects and allow the wasp to lay her eggs on or inside of the unwitting host, similar to how many coinobiont wasps operate today, though without the freaky anatomy. Staying in Southeast Asia, a new pterosaur was named from Upper Cretaceous rocks in Thailand. Discovered exactly 2 years prior by a research team led by Sita Manitgun, Gyrodapterus buffetati is the first pterosaur named from the region and is represented by a partial upper jaw and a few pieces of teeth. These pieces were similar enough to better-known pterosaurs for this species to be identified as a type of Gnathosaurine, a unique group of flamingo-esque filter feeders that were around during the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous. We'll round out the roster back where we started in Patagonia, with the naming of Tukinsuchus salamancensis, a new Nodosuchian described by Gonzalo Gabriel Bravo and co. Hailing from the Salamanca Formation, this 5-meter-long terrestrial croc cousin is notable for the time period it comes from, just 2 to 3 million years after the infamous bolide strike that wiped out most land animals larger than a cat. Since large Nodosuchians are known from both before and after the impact event, it wasn't known if the small ones survived and then re-evolved large body sizes, or if the big ones just kept pushing through. This discovery, so temporarily close to the extinction event, suggests the second option. Nodosuchians were doing something right that allowed them to persist as large land animals where most other species failed. Moving on from new taxa, the next few studies focused more on comparative anatomy. Because these kinds of studies require a bit more in-depth explanation, I'm going to skip over some of them, but again, please check out the description if you want to read further. Most of these papers are publicly available to read in full. If you can't access one, shoot me an email and I can help you out. This first one is fairly straightforward based on the title. Until about 15 years ago, coloration was something we never thought we'd actually be able to know about fossil animals. But the discovery of pigment-bearing cells called melanosomes across a growing number of well-enough preserved dinosaur feathers and scales has changed that. This study, led by Ruoshuang Li, took this approach to mammals, sampling the fossilized fur of 6 different Mesozoic mammalia forms from China for traces of melanosomes, and comparing them to those found in living mammals. They found a near uniform abundance of eumelanin, which creates monochromatic shades of dark brown and gray, or black. The author team suggests that this consistent coloration across an ecologically diverse range of mammals, from burrowers to tree-dwelling gliders, is a sign that mammals started off as fairly dull-colored animals and didn't diversify their pelt palettes until after the extinction of large, keen-eyed dinosaurian predators, though this will require more fossils to bear that out. Another study of some paleoartistic note revealed evidence of a new and unexpected cheek-like soft tissue structure in dinosaurs. This was found by creating and examining thin sections of bone in parts of the jaw where muscles and tendons would attach, specifically the jugal and the rearward bones of the mandible. By comparing these regions to those of living archosaurs, the researchers were able to determine what those attachment points look like on a microscopic level, and were then able to reconstruct what this muscle structure would look like in different dinosaur groups. I mentioned earlier that this was of some paleoartistic note. As artist and lead author Henry Sharp noted online as everyone was freaking out about this doesn't really change too much for most dinosaurs unless you're specifically depicting their muscles. The only groups that might have had a significantly noticeable difference are the ceratopsids and tyrannosaurs, smoothing out the cheek region a bit to give it a less horn-like appearance. Going deeper into vertebrate anatomy, we had 2 studies revealing evidence of arboreality in 2 separate branches of the synapsid family tree. The first was a description by Stephen Chester and colleagues of a newly discovered and fairly complete skeleton from New Mexico of a Mixodectes pungens, an evolutionarily early relative of primates and colugos from about 62 million years ago. The paper breaks down every part of its skeleton from head to toe and describes how these features would make for a good climber and long-term tree dweller. The second paper, led by Saskia Niecki, looked at a much earlier mammal relative called Suminia getmanovi. A basal and early member of the anomodonts, which are more famously known for the Permian and Triassic Dicynodonts, Suminia inhabited the forests of Russia some 260-ish million years ago, and has been suspected to be arboreal since at least the 2010s, based on the anatomy of its limbs and likely prehensile tail. This newest study took the analysis even deeper, comparing the limb proportions and thin sections from several limb bones to compare to living tree-dwelling mammals. The bones all showed similarly low ratios of bone wall thickness, an adaptation that lightens the skeleton and thus makes it easier for the animals to climb. The final animal-focused study we'll talk about in this category concerns everyone's favorite giant extinct fish, Otodus megalodon. Now, for reasons I don't have time to explain here, I don't particularly like megalodon. And this is a very long paper that covers a lot of things and has one of the longest author lists I've ever seen for a paleontological study, so I admittedly skimmed a lot of this. But here are the big takeaways from Kenshu Shimada and colleagues. Firstly, this study supports the idea that megalodon was a proportionately long-bodied shark, which fits with the hydrodynamic needs of being a large ocean predator. With new proportions calculated from teeth, vertebrae, and other related sharks, they estimate that it could have reached over 24 meters, or nearly 80 feet long, and at that size would have weighed about 94 tons, with a cruising speed in the range of 2 to 3.5 kilometers per hour. Secondly, based on these calculations, this size would put newborn megalodons in the 3.5 to 4 meter range, so about the size of a large oceanic white-tip shark. Based on this, they suggest that babies may not have used coastal nurseries as much or for as long as previously suggested, which may have put them into more direct competition with white sharks once they appeared, and that might have played a role in their ultimate extinction. Moving on to creatures and topics I actually like talking about, I have to take a minute to mention some Jurassic studies real quick. We've got evidence by Mauricio Garcia and colleagues showing healed craniofacial injuries in over 40% of the Herrerasaurid skulls they sampled. Granted, that's a sample size of only 7, but even then, the fact that nearly half of them are injured in similar ways suggests that this type of face-biting behavior happened pretty frequently and goes back to the earliest stages of dinosaur evolution. Adam Fitch and colleagues described 2 new poposaurid femora from North Carolina, which expands the known range of these bipedal dinosaur-like croc cousins into the current-day East Coast and the Triassic-aged Atlantic Rift region. Gorgonopsians also got a bit of a range expansion, with a southern African team led by Zanildo Makungo describing a new partial skull from northern Mozambique, which they identified as belonging to the large saber-toothed predator Inostrancevia africana, which had formerly only been known from South African rocks. I know this is a Permian, not Triassic animal, but it's close enough and I like Gorgonopsians. Plus I happened to meet Zanildo at a meeting last month, so shout out to a new acquaintance. Moving back into and through the Triassic, the last 2 studies in this section analyze the changes in habitats and ecosystems over the course of the period. Ragon, Charlene, and colleagues created simulations of the global climate based on the Pangean plant fossil record in order to understand how habitats shifted before, during, and immediately after the Permian-Triassic extinction event, aka the Great Dying, the largest mass extinction event in Earth's history. The models show a general warming trend in the 700,000 years following the extinction event, with average global temperatures increasing by 10 degrees Celsius thanks to the intense volcanic activity. The warming climate expanded deserts in the center of Pangaea, while temperate and tropical forests replaced shrubland and tundra-like environments at higher latitudes. A study led by Udal Mujal picks up the story, specifically focusing on the shifting paleo environments and ecosystems of the Central European Basin across the whole Triassic period. There's a good amount of detail in here about the temporal and environmental distribution of different tetrapod groups and their habitat preferences that I don't have time to explain in full, even as a summary, but feel free to pause on one of the best graphical abstracts I've ever seen to take it all in. Certainly a handy guide for anyone interested in the Triassic history of Central Europe. Not every paleontological news story came out in the form of a published peer-reviewed paper, though. The genetic engineering, probably going to end up as a designer pets company, Colossal Biosciences, started their 2025 media blitz with those admittedly adorable woolly mice that they made as a proof of concept on their road to making a mammoth. I'll save the dire SciComm situation they created for someone else in this series to recap over the next few days. In the meantime, take a listen to the Dinosaur Choir, a new hadrosaur-inspired instrument created by musicians Courtney Brown and Cezary Gajewski that debuted and won 3rd place at the 27th Guthman Musical Instrument Competition. Musical auditoriums weren't the only civil halls seeing some fossil-related action. In mid-March, a lawsuit was filed against New Jersey's William Patterson University by one of their environmental science professors, Martin Becker. In June of 2024, Becker, a paleontologist by practice, had sent about 200 Devonian fossils from his collection to a colleague in Florida with the intent of working on a collaborative project. After getting reports that the package had never arrived at its destination and 3 months of no useful updates, he finally learned in mid-September that UPS had canceled the university's account back in April because they'd failed to pay several outstanding invoices. The UPS fraud department had then intercepted the packages and dumped all 19 boxes into an unidentified landfill somewhere in or around Nashville, Tennessee. The details of Becker's lawsuit remain unspecified, but several news outlets reported that he was seeking, among other things, medical expenses for the emotional distress the ordeal caused him. So, if you ever find yourself in or around Nashville and want a really memorable fossil hunting story, there you go. On the topic of saving pieces of natural heritage, an academic report published by Maximilian Felix Chame and colleagues from Tanzania and Germany discussed the current state of efforts to preserve the Tendaguru paleontological site. As I mentioned in my last Paleo Rewind video back in 2021, the late Jurassic Tendaguru Formation in northwestern Tanzania hosted the largest fossil dig in history, with hundreds of local Africans working under early 20th century German colonial rule to locate, excavate, and transport over 225 tons of fossils in just a 4-year period. Fossils that have ultimately ended up as a museum centerpiece far from their place of origin, like the famous Giraffatitan in Berlin. This paper provides an overview of the scientific, economic, and management challenges left behind in the wake of the colonial-era fossil rush, from the lack of proper description and preservation of the Tendaguru site to the local economic and cultural desire to have their dinosaurs returned home. There's a lot in this paper, and it's well worth a read for anyone interested in the human side of paleontology from an often overlooked perspective. Continuing on this thread of the effects of scientific colonialism, another study led by Ana Valenzuela Toro looked at the biases on research and citation patterns in Latin American paleontology. They specifically looked at the last 30 years of publication trends on fossil aquatic mammals, a well-represented category in the continent's rock layers. The results are generally unsurprising. Authorship teams tend to be led by researchers from the global north and skew heavily male, even when the fossils themselves have not been removed from the region of origin, and in some Latin American countries, the majority of paleontologists specializing in these creatures are women. These patterns then go on to be reinforced by who gets cited in subsequent studies, creating a cycle of underrepresentation and continual inequity, even while the gender gap in Latin American paleontology has been steadily decreasing. Proposed strategies to address these issues should sound fairly familiar to anyone involved in genuine DEI work. For example, scientists at institutions in more privileged positions need to cultivate and maintain symmetrical relationships with their Global South collaborators. Journals need to acknowledge the institutional barriers to publication, like writing in a second or third language, and accommodate accordingly. And scientific institutions and societies should not shy away from meaningful representation of the diversity of people in their fields. This applies to science in general, but particularly in such a globe-spanning subject like paleontology. Just look at everywhere we've been in the last 15-ish minutes. For our final entry, we have a study led by Corentin Laron on the identity of Prototaxites, the Earth's first large terrestrial life forms. These strange 8-meter-tall organisms towered over the early Devonian landscapes some 400 million years ago, and have long been considered a giant fungus. However, this new study, admittedly still a preprint at this point, looked at a combination of cellular and molecular information and compared that to modern and extinct fungi. The results suggest something particularly interesting: that Prototaxides belongs to a new, entirely different, completely extinct lineage of multicellular eukaryotes. Just sit with that for a second. Imagine discovering a whole other kingdom of life from the deep past. If that's not a mic drop moment, I don't know what is.
Starting off strong on April 2nd, a study was released on Cretaceous mammal sizes, with our relatives and ancestors seemingly pivoting to a more ground-based lifestyle leading up to the KPG mass extinction event. The small size of mammals in the late Cretaceous is of course most likely put down to the dinosaurs, with the largest mammal, Raphinomammus, still only coming in at a size of a small dog around this time. When investigating fragmentary mammal remains from the late Cretaceous, however, they found that not only did mammals increase in diversity, they also increased in size. This sudden mammalian biodiversity may be brought down to an increase in vegetation such as angiosperms in the late Cretaceous, allowing for more terrestrial mammals to survive. The study concludes that vegetation of the late Cretaceous had far more of an influence on mammals than the reign of the dinosaurs. On April 7th, a new genus of the elusive group Metriacanthosauridae called Tamariaptor xingxiensis was described from a complete skull and vertebrae in mid-Jurassic rock in China. This skull looks mangled as hell, but actually gives us a good insight into one of the earliest diverging members of Metriacanthosauridae, a group we rarely find good remains of, with its placement within the Allosauridae family being a slight mystery. It was found along with 10 cervical vertebrae, helping us estimate a size of over 8 meters. It is an important discovery because it widens the depth of knowledge on the evolution of Metriacanthosaurids in Asia. Also on April 7th, Colossal Biosciences announced the successful creation of free direwolf pups that use genome editing to revive an extinct species, modifying the living genes of wolves to match those of the extinct direwolf. No actual direwolf DNA was used, however, and Colossal Biosciences quickly backtracked on their previous statement, clarifying that these were just grey wolves with genetic modifications such as more fur and a larger skull size. This isn't even the first time Colossal Biosciences has hugely misled the public. I mean, they continue to be a joke among academics, but are still a loud and serious voice in the de-extinction conversation, seemingly not realizing how harmful their statements can be. The real use for their science in helping living species that are going extinct doesn't seem to be a point of public attention, and so Colossal Biosciences seeks large headlines instead of actually making progress in the scientific world. On April 9th, some pretty huge news occurred, with a fossil mandible being found in Taiwan, turning out to belong to the prehistoric human species of the Denisovans. The mandible was around 190,000 to 10,000 years old. Due to how rare fossils of Denisovans are, with them being mistaken for Homo sapien or Neanderthals, outside of Denisova Cave, it is hard to find confirmed specimens. Incredibly exciting for people who want to learn more about our ancient cousins and to diversify our fossil record of these people. April 14th saw a new ichnospecies, a species known from traces or footprints described, and named Rhupodosaurus clava, found in the British Columbia and Alberta area. All nodosaurid ankylosaur footprints have 4 toes left on the ground. Rhupodosaurus has 3 toes instead, making it the first known ankylosaurid ankylosaur footprints in the world. Someday, we can hopefully find the animal that made these footprints, but until then, the mysterious Rhupodosaurus shall remain hidden in the snowy mountains of Canada. I've already covered this prehistoric animal on Nature's Compendium's wonderful new video. In a simple twist of fate, I end up covering it again, which is a pleasure. The earliest and newest species of the Rebecasaurid family, Ciencia argentina sanchezi, was described on April 14th of this year. It is known from 3 partial fragmentary skeletons found in the Huincal Formation, making it the 4th Rebecasaurid to be discovered from this area. These remains were found near a titanosaur, Shokonosaurus. This new study does not only help us understand the most basal Rebecasaurid to date, It also gives us an insight into the life of the Huincal Formation 97 to 93 million years ago. I love crayfish. Back in 2022, I had my GoPro and used it to video invasive crayfish from my local nature reserve. And if I was a New Zealander 20 million years ago, I might be more cautious when filming them. A new crayfish, clocking in at 25 centimeters in length, in comparison to the 8 centimeter long modern counterparts, was discovered. Crayfish do not fossilize, so this study was almost entirely conducted off of jaws preserved, known from just 8 fragments. It allows a challenging but unique look into the prehistoric crayfish from New Zealand 20 million years ago. Rounding off this news with something also marine, described on April 21st in Lebanon, 2 well-preserved freshwater isopods from the early Cretaceous period were discovered, sharing a new insight into the multiple independent occasions these animals have colonized a freshwater environment. Named Dryopodus gazelle, it belonged to the group Cimothodia, heavily resembling living species. It was incredibly small, coming in at 1.8 to 2.5 centimeters.
The first paper we'll be covering focuses on Cretaceous North Africa. Published on May 5th, co-authors Andrea Cao and Alessandro Paterna analyzed the specimens and material known from the early and late Cretaceous taxa Cryptops, Eocarcharia, Bahariosaurus, Deltadromeus, and the recently named Tamariaptor. Cryptops and Eocarcharia, which were described in the same paper in 2008, are found to both be chimeric taxa. Both paratype specimens found alongside the holotype for both theropods strangely belong to an indeterminate Allosauriod, and while the phylogeny for Cryptops remains the same, Eocarcharia has changed significantly, as the single lacrimal of the holotype it's known by is now believed to potentially come from a baryonychine spinosaurid, much like the contemporary Suchomimus. Additionally, the Egyptian Bahariosaurus, once believed to be one of the largest megaraptorans ever found, along with the highly enigmatic Moroccan Deltadromeus, are now discovered to be the same taxa, but since Bahariosaurus was named first, this gives it priority over Deltadromeus, and therefore, it's now considered a junior synonym. Although Cao and Paterna aren't the first to propose this new phylogeny for Deltadromeus or Bahariosaurus, the authors also find that Bahariosaurus could be a part of the Abelosauroidea superfamily, making them distantly related to animals like Carnotaurus. Although, unlike Nizar Ibrahim's Kemkembed's paper in 2020, it is instead hypothesized that Bahariosaurus belongs to an as of yet undiscovered family of ornithomimosaur-like abelisaurs closely related to noasaurids. Tamariaptor, which was described in January, more on that in Dino Guy's Paleo Rewind, is also placed within Carcharodontosaurinae after the new genus was found being far more closely related to Carcharodontosaurus than previously thought in its formal description. Overall, this paper is jam-packed with phylogenetic and taxonomic changes for genera new and old, and it certainly changes our understanding of North African dinosaurs that lived in the middle of the Cretaceous. Moving on to the next paper of this month, we have a new genus of Herrerasaurian dinosaur from the late Triassic of India named Malariaptor kuti. Its generic and specific names refer to the Upper Malari Formation, where it was found in 1985, and its discoverer Tharvet S. kuti, who initially described the type specimen ISIR 282 in 2011. The holotype specimen is only known by fragments of the pelvic girdle and a single caudal vertebra. Although not known by much, this new genus is important to the evolutionary history of these early dinosaurs, as Malariaptor is officially the first of its kind found in India, and it is diagnosable enough to be considered distinct from another fragmented taxon, Alwalcaria, a basal saurischian from the older, lower Malari Formation. Now, probably one of the most profound papers of this month was the revival of Troodon. Between 2011 and 2017, the taxon was considered as a nomen dubium and was eventually replaced by its synonym, Stenonychosaurus. Additionally, some specimens previously referred to Troodon were assigned to the genus Latenovenatrix. In other words, Troodon was split into 2 different genera. However, over the years, paleontologist David J. Verricchio and his colleagues have come to disagree with this this assessment and thought that Troodos should still be the proper name for this taxon. In fact, Stenonychosaurus had never been used as a distinct taxon in the past 30 years since it was synonymized to Troodon by Philip J. Curry. As such, Varicchio and colleagues published a new paper that brought back Troodon as a valid taxon once again, describing 3 new specimens uncovered from the Jack's birthday site located in the Two Medicine Formation, one of which, being MOR 553, is known by a collection of bones from individuals of different ages. Because of the new material and comparing them to what Stenonychosaurus is known for, it has once again been found as a junior synonym to Troodon. If that's not all, Lieutenant Venatrix is also found to be another potential synonym, but the authors are open to the possibility of it being completely distinct if more evidence comes forward. The authors are also recommending MOR 553 to the ICCN to designate it as the neotype specimen for Troodon, despite the holotype not being lost or destroyed. In conclusion, the revival of Troodon is one of many great comebacks for extinct taxa in recent memory, and it certainly wouldn't be the last for 2025 either. In other news, a new Cambrian radiodont was discovered from the famous Burgess Shale, located in what is now British Columbia in Canada. The new taxon is known by more than 60 specimens discovered in the last 30 years. This basal most herded, named Mothra fentoni, is named after the iconic insect kaiju Mothra, otherwise known in Japan as Mosura, which is where the generic name comes from, and it was named after the benevolent kaiju for its moth-like appearance. Names aside, the amount of specimens discovered in this paper shows that Mosura is already a well-understood taxon, reaching lengths of 1.5 to 6.1 centimeters. It is among one of the smallest radiodonts ever discovered. Its body proportions show that Mosura was an active and highly maneuverable nectonic predator, hunting prey close to its own size and tracking them using their 3 eyes. Because of its abnormally large gill apparatus, Mosura might have even hunted in deeper waters where oxygen was low. The discovery of this small, unique predator not only adds to the diversity of radiodonts and other predators in the Burgess Shale, but it also shows how well adapted these arthropods were in the many different environments they called home. It is indeed a fantastic find. Moving forward to the Triassic, the possible defense capabilities for a sauropodomorph have been discovered. Plateosaurus, a dinosaur from late Triassic rocks of Western Europe, was one of many large herbivores ancestral to the iconic long-necked sauropods. One specimen of P. trossingensis, initially described in 2015, was analyzed in this new publication. After studying the measurements of the caudal vertebrae and using biomechanical modeling, the idea of Plateosaurus using its tail like a whip is proposed, being used to defend itself from predation and possibly used during interactions with members of its kind. The speed and power of this tail, if used as such, is compared to extant and extinct long-tailed reptiles like monitor lizards, iguanas, and even diplodocoid sauropods. And although it's currently a hypothesis, further research will need to be done in order to finally conclude this. If this is true, however, this shows paleontologists what kinds of defenses primitive sauropods used early on in their evolution, and this means that even the earliest members of these iconic long-necked dinosaurs predated their whip-tailed descendants by millions of years, evolving them far earlier than previously expected. Yet another incredible study. Focusing our attention back to British Columbia, a new elasmosaurid was described. Elasmosaurs are well known for being the largest long-necked plesiosaurs ever discovered, iconic for their large size and long necks reaching half of their entire body length, with some even exceeding more than half. This new paper formally names the first and only plesiosaur, specifically an elasmosaurid, to ever be discovered on Vancouver Island. Known by 2 partial skeletons discovered between 1988 and 2020 in the Santonian-aged Haslam Formation, and given many different nicknames over the decades, the plesiosaur was finally given the name Trascasaurus sandrae by lead author F. Robin O'Keefe. The genus and species are in turn named after the discoverers of the holotype specimen and the lead author's mother. Although on the smaller side of Elasmosauridae, Trascasaura is unique in anatomy, particularly with the skull. Its large, thin teeth and the width of its jaws is comparable to basal aristonectines, a bizarre clade of filter feeders from the southern hemisphere. However, this idea is suggested to be a result of convergent evolution. Either way, its phylogenetic placement shows it's closely related to basal elasmosaurs instead, and is placed as a sister taxon to the equally bizarre Nacononectes from Montana. The discovery of Trascasaura is huge for Vancouver Island. Its presence shows that the island was once occupied by a rich and pristine underwater ecosystem teeming with both primitive and advanced life of all different shapes and sizes. And finally, for our last publication, we travel back to the Paleozoic once again, this time in the Permian period. New trace fossils of an early Permian synapsid were identified from the Tambach Formation located in Germany. This fossil, like any other trace fossils, preserves footprints of the animal, which is identified to be from a sphenacodontid, a family of stem mammals that the iconic sailback Dimetrodon is from. However, the trace fossil also shows the animal that made these tracks rested on its underbelly. This in turn preserves the integument of this long-gone predator. The trace fossil was assigned as a new ichnotaxon of fossil tracks named Bromacarichnis requiescens. This is a rather important find because it gives paleontologists our first look into sphenacodontid integument, revealing that the limbs, trunk, and tail of this family tree were actually covered in epidermal scales rather than soft skin or hair like their descendants. This gives them a more reptilian appearance than previously thought. This fantastic find gives us more insight into what kind of skin the earliest ancestors of all living and extinct mammals had, and this gives us a better understanding about the full appearance of sphenacodontids, one of the most successful predators to have lived between the Carboniferous and Permian periods.
Was the Cambrian explosion not as explosive as we once thought? My friends, it's another beautiful day and time for part 1 of Paleo Rewind 2025, where we look at some of the most interesting papers published in June. To kick things off, we delve back in time to the Ediacaran period, where it appears that life was already becoming more complex and mobile preceding the Cambrian explosion. The Ediacaran is an interesting place in deep time, being the last period of the Phanerozoic eon before the Cambrian, which is known for things like Anomalocaris. However, in the Ediacaran, we rarely have preservation of body fossils, and the ones that we do have are very often ambiguous. What we do have, though, is an abundance of trace fossils, and Wang et al. 2025 capitalizes on this, using a quantitative method to test when slender, bilaterian-style animals first appeared. To do this, 111 trace fossil specimens from 12 different formations were analyzed, some of these specimens including Gordia, Helminthopsis, and Archaeonassa, spanning in time from the terminal Ediacaran to the early Cambrian. Using integral scale analysis, Wang et al. 2025 found that before roughly 545 million years ago, estimated body length to width ratios were typically small, with the trails showing abrupt turns and irregular paths. And it can be inferred that the trace makers likely had short, ovoid, or ellipsoidal bodies with limited directional control. But after 545 million years ago, we see those length to width ratios go up, with the trails becoming smoother, more directional, and less maneuverable, inferring that we had the emergence of slender, elongated bodies with bilateral organization. This would seem to show that slender, bilaterian-style animals began to appear before the Cambrian explosion, with these animals modifying the substrate they lived in, increasing ecological complexity, and enabling a cascading diversification of life, hinting that the Cambrian explosion reflects ecological amplification and not the sudden anatomical changes that we had previously thought. Did you hear the news? There's another new Tyrannosaurid. That's right, my friends, it's another beautiful day, and we're continuing coverage for the month of June with Paleo Rewind 2025. This time we're heading to late Cretaceous Mongolia, where a medium-sized Tyrannosaurid called Conulu Mongoliensis was recently described from. First discovered in the 1970s, this newly described Tyrannosaurid is pretty groundbreaking, because it overturns decades of thinking of how the Tyrannosaurid family tree worked. But what was Conulu like in life? Well, by looking at the two partial skeletons found in the Cretaceous Bay and Shri Formation, Voris et al. 2025 describes it as a medium-sized Tyrannosaurid, much smaller than T-Rex itself, with a slender, lightly built body and long legs adapted for running. Its skull was also narrow. This sounds like a young Tyrannosaurid. However, certain bone features show that these individuals were fully grown. See, Conulu was placed just outside the Eutyrannosauria on the family tree, making it the closest known relative to the giant tyrannosaurs. You can think of it as the last step before they got really big.
So what's the big takeaway from this new species? Well, aside from the fact that a new Tyrannosaur is always cool, this changes the old view of Tyrannosaur relations, with the old view that shallow-snouted Tyrannosaurs were more primitive than deep-snouted ones like T-Rex. Instead, Voris et al. 2025 suggests that Aleoramini and Tyrannosaurini are sister groups that both evolved from a similar ancestor, similar to our friend Canculu here. It's time for everyone's favorite archaeological controversy. That's right, the date for earliest human habitation in the Americas got pushed back by 9,000 years in June of this year. But how did we go from arrival 14,000 years before present to 23,000 years before the present? It's all thanks to these amazingly preserved footprints in White Sands National Park, New Mexico. Found on the eastern margin of Paleo Lake Otero in the Tularosa Basin, these footprints would have been formed not in the desert that southern New Mexico is today, but in a much more marshy environment full of megafaunal life like mammoths and ground sloths. We've also found their footprints and their poop preserved there as well. So how did we get that date? Holliday et al. 2025 used accelerator mass spectrometry, or AMS, to radiocarbon date samples of the preserved mud in which the footprints were found, as well as rupia seeds and pollen from the sedimentary layers. They also checked and confirmed for stratigraphic consistency, meaning that older dates occurred lower in the sedimentary layers and younger ones occurred higher. So why is this important? Because not only do these findings provide direct evidence of a much earlier human occupation in the Americas, but it also shows just how drastically different our planet was just a short time ago. Geologically speaking, of course.
To begin this video, in the present day, Tuatara stand alone as the sole surviving member of an order of lizard-like reptiles known as rhynchocephalians. And it's a great surprise for many to learn that said group encompassed a wide range of different body plans and niches in their respective environments many millions of years ago, with the snake-like pleurosaurs swimming through marine environments, and herbivorous alenodontines utilising their batteries of wide teeth to crunch through thick vegetation. This extends even to the treetops, as this paper published on July 2nd suggests, with a newly described species having some interesting adaptations that shows that this group was potentially even more diverse than previously thought. This animal was named as Spheinodraco scandentis, with spheno meaning wedge in ancient Greek and draco being the Latin for dragon, both being a reference to the clade of Sphenodontia, and also to the arboreal nature of the animals of which their limb proportions are most comparable, as we'll get into. Their species name of scandentis is also derived from the Latin words meaning climber, which is also especially relevant. Getting to where they were found, they were discovered in the Solnhofen limestone in the Altmühltal formation in Germany. Of course, Germany back in the late Jurassic 160 million years ago was a very different place, not being the temperate place it is today, but instead a tropical archipelago made up of many different islands. This area is known for many zones of oxygen in the area's lagoons, making it so that any animal that fell through the water column or swept into them after dying on land were then preserved in exceptional condition. With no scavengers or high currents about to rip apart and disarticulate carcasses, the bodies of the animals that lived in the area, including Spheinodraco, could drift down to the murky depths below in peace, then being covered in the soft muds at the bottom of the lagoons over time. This now means that what we have is a well-preserved little animal, and one that after being assessed was found to have some neat adaptations which they would be named after. Their limbs were found to be relatively long compared to that of other rhynchocephalians, and also to that of other living squamates, which were also included in the wider datasets, with Spheinodraco matching up the closest to the green-crested lizards and Draco, both arboreal animals with very similar proportions. Their relatively longer forelimbs, elongated digits, as well as their recurved claws, is also something found in these arboreal lizards. Therefore, to sum things up briefly, Spheinodraco is regarded now as the first strictly arboreal rhynchocephalian known, something which expands our knowledge on their overall diversity, a diversity that has now sadly been lost to time. Continuing on, the mouthparts of filter-feeding whales are some of the most extreme and fascinating anatomical features in the animal kingdom, and their adaptations make them impressive subjects to study for this reason. They're made even more exceptional in that the fossil record has scant evidence for any tetrapod that has the same kind of convergently evolved adaptation. That was until the discovery of Hupeosuchus, a small marine reptile from the early Triassic that seemed to fit all of the criteria of being similarly adapted and functionally filter-feeding. Compared to bowhead whales, the case of their filter-feeding prowess was mainly based on similarities that were noted by perceived similarities in their skull, being looked at through geometric morphometrics of the 2D landmarks they had present. However, such similarities, as published in a paper on July 4th, show that this perceived similarity wasn't really the case, as the initial studies involving Hupesuchus were deemed to have flawed methodology, most importantly and critically using a dataset of extant cetaceans that didn't match well with the morphology of respective species, with many unrealistic data points being found that with their flawed examination meant that Hupesuchus in fact didn't have any morphospace overlap with any of the studied cetaceans, which therefore invalidates a filter feeding mode for them. Collecting a new set of landmarks for the study, the team involved with this paper set out to see how the results would change when using more accurate data along the original author's intentions. Something which was also assessed was the metabolism of Hupesuchus through some energetic studies, the results of which showed that a baleen whale style of feeding wouldn't be able to net them enough food to survive, given their only 1 meter long length, and not to mention their long neck, the lack of an intraoral space for baleen to be placed, and a comparatively small head, are also not really traits that would be the most suitable for the often repeated ram feeding methods that baleen whales undertake to feed. Hupesuchus does however show some convergences with pelicans, so some form of ram feeding is still potentially possible for them, though more work does need to be done to determine more of these specifics. The genus of Longosquama, found from middle through late Triassic rocks in Kazakhstan, is one of the strangest of all extinct animals, with them being known from a holotype that preserved their front half, which is overall quite lizard-like and fairly typical. What however isn't is their strange filament-looking structures at the top of their body, which are absolutely huge, and some researchers found them to be so strange that their conclusions were that there was some form of gliding structure, and in some cases, not even a part of them, instead being some kind of plant. However, most seem to suggest that there was some form of structure akin to, but not the same as feathers, with them not having barbs and other features that make them up. This has therefore meant there's been a lot of debate in terms of what exactly these structures were used for, and also as to where Longosquama fit phylogenetically with other reptiles. With all of this, Longosquama was a huge enigma in paleontology, but the find of an animal recently that looks to be closely related has helped to expand our knowledge, and has helped to clear at least some things up. Described from rocks dating to 247 million years ago from the Middle Triassic of France, new finds of both 2 preserved animals of the same species, as well as 80 other isolated and tegumentary appendages, similar to the striking ones found on Longosquama, were described. Named as Mirasaura gravoduli, their bird-like skull and overall anatomy suggest that them, and therefore Longosquama, are some form of Trypanosauromorph, animals that mostly took on arboreal forms and mimicked anteaters like the Tamandua in terms of their niche. Because of Mirasaura's discovery, the development of complex integumentary appendages are now known more clearly to not just be restricted to avimetatarsalians, or archosaurs closer to birds than to crocodiles, as well as mammalia forms, but as evolutionary roots right amongst basal amniotes, so this overall is a rather remarkable discovery and description. Velociraptor is, as we all know, one of the most famous dinosaurs of all time, boosted by the rather disparate Jurassic Park counterparts. But with their fame, their other closest relatives in their family of Dromaeosauridae do tend to be sidelined, which is a great shame, as they are a rather diverse family of animals that have a great range of body types and also habitat preferences. One of these animals is from the same region of the world that Velociraptor is from, being Shri Devi from late Cretaceous Mongolia, which was named after the Buddhist deity of the same name in 2021, which was described off of a partial postcranial skeleton from the Barn Goyot Formation, a site which is slightly younger than the one Velociraptor is found in, the Jagota Formation. Shri, however, is now no longer a monotypic taxon, as a new species, named as Shri rapax, was described in July, and from the bones we have, was a very clearly different animal in terms of their general proportions. Distinct from Shri Devi by way of vertebral, neck, and skull differences, Shri rapax, the species name meaning rapacious in Latin, named so after the hypertrophied first digits, which we got into, being well preserved and articulated, having an overall quite robust frame that set them apart from their closest relative, which was determined to be Velociraptor themselves. The main standouts from the finds are 1. How complete and articulated they are, and 2. The general frame of them being rather stocky in comparison to other Velociraptorines. Their first digit, for example, is especially impressive, as this claw is proportionally larger than is known of in any other dromaeosaurid of which the hands are preserved. This, coupled with their shorter skull, suggests that they had an even more powerful bite than other Velociraptorines, meaning that Shri was a capable grappler of an animal, certainly more so adapted to such a niche than their relatives. The crazy thing with all of this is that the specimen may well not have been able to have been studied, as it was illegally poached at some time prior to 2010, and therefore we don't know the exact formation and date from the rocks from which they were found, and was afterwards held in private Japanese and English collections up until being purchased by the French company of Eldonia in 2016, with the skull and the first 4 articulated neck vertebrae being taken to then be scanned at the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, with these remains as of now having unknown whereabouts, which is a testament as to how shaky the field of paleontology can be.
We're going to start off really strong with 2 of my favorite subjects combined, paleontology and whales. On August 12th, researchers from Australia announced the discovery of a new species of ancient whale called Janjucetus dollardi. This dolphin-sized baleen whale lived about 25 to 26 million years ago during the Oligocene in what is now Victoria's Surf Coast in southeastern Australia. The fossil includes a well-preserved skull, ear bones, and teeth. It had very large forward-facing eyes, and this gives us a good idea into how Janjucetus likely hunted and how it survived its Oligocene environment. Now you might have noticed something there. Janjucetus was in fact a very early form of baleen whale, but it still had teeth, which is really important for us to understand. Because it had teeth and therefore likely fed on larger fish, this shows that early on in Misticete evolution, they had yet to adapt their feeding strategy to the bulk filter feeders that their modern-day descendants are known for. Now, the discussion over how baleen whales evolved their baleen has kind of always been up for debate. There's currently 2 main theories proposed. The first one being that baleen whales, over the course of a few million years, replaced their teeth gradually with developing baleen as they transitioned to a filter-feeding lifestyle. The second theory is a little bit different, proposing that early mysticetes started suction feeding along the seafloor, and over time they lost their teeth entirely. And as they started to develop baleen to better filter out all the sediment and the small animals in the sediment, they transitioned from suction feeding to open water filter feeding like they're known today. Whichever theory that you want to go with, Janjucetus was clearly before that transition ever happened, as it still had a full set of teeth in its mouth. Along with its very large eyes, this gives us a really good idea into how early mysticetes were behaving and hunting in their environment. The discovery of Janjucetus basically gives us a better understanding of this time in whale evolution, showing that the transition from a toothed predator to a gentle filter feeder was a lot more complex than we kind of initially were assuming. Janjucetus sits at the very base of the Mysticete evolution, just after the Archaeocetes, which are the ancient whales prior to our modern-day lineages, the Odontocetes and the Mysticetes. But it's still outside the lineage of whales that would become the true baleen whales. Janjucetus overall represents an early form of Mysticete that lived at a time before Mysticetes evolved their signature feeding ability, and this gives us a better understanding into the evolutionary lineage and direction that whales took as they continued to take over the oceans. But that's not where the discussion around baleen whale evolution ends for the month of August 2025, because there was not just one species of baleen whale uncovered in the form of Janjucetus, there was another one, this time dating back to about 9 million years ago in Japan, called Megabalena saporoensis. This discovery is actually really important for our understanding of right whale evolution. They first appear in the fossil record about 20 million years ago, about 5 million years after the existence of Janjucetus. But there is a nearly 9 million year gap in the right whale fossil record, where we have basically no fossils whatsoever to speak of. And Megabalena existed right in the middle of that 9 million year gap, and it's a nearly complete specimen. A majority of this species was unearthed with this single fossil discovery, including the skull, vertebrae, ribs, limbs, and more, which gives us a huge look into how right whales were evolving in the middle of that gap in the fossil record that we previously didn't have any specimens of. This discovery also gives us a huge amount of insight into the size and diversity of right whales back then. Measuring in at about 13 meters long, Megabalena for a right whale is really small, but for a right whale 9 million years ago, it was actually really large. Because of the gap in the fossil record, we kind of assumed that right whales didn't get to their very large sizes like today's whales until later in their evolution. But with Megabalena being one of the largest right whales for its time, and being in the middle of that evolutionary gap on the fossil record, it shows that right whales started getting a lot bigger a lot sooner than we previously thought. So not only does Megabalena represent a new species of right whale for us to study and better understand, it represents a missing link for right whale evolution. And that's really important for anyone like me who loves paleontology but also really loves whales. Moving on from whale discoveries, we're going to go much further back in time and discuss the oldest known representative of the Ankylosaur family of dinosaurs, and one of the most armored animals ever discovered. Spicomelis afer is the oldest known ankylosaur and the only ankylosaur discovered in Africa, specifically Morocco, and it lived in the Jurassic period about 165 million years ago. This places Spicomelis right at the beginning of the ankylosaur lineage, shortly after their separation from the lineage that would eventually become the stegosaurs. Spicomelis was originally described in 2019 by a partial spiky rib bone, and it wasn't until 2023 where a team of researchers went back to where that first fossil was found and uncovered a lot more of this animal, announcing the discovery in August of 25. And holy crap, was this animal unbelievably well armored. Not only did it have the overall bony osteoderms that other ankylosaurs are known for, it also had a huge array of spikes covering its entire body, from 3-meter spikes growing out of its neck and shoulders to large spikes coming out of its thighs. It seemed to have had a spiny weapon at the end of its tail that would eventually become the club weapons of later species, and it also had a huge amount of spikes all over its back and sides. It is, without a doubt, the most armored animal in history, but that's what makes it really interesting, because this means that as ankylosaurs continued to evolve, they lost some of their armor over time. One of the most famous ankylosaurs is Ankylosaurus itself, and it lived 100 million years after Spicomelis at the very end of the Cretaceous period, and it didn't have any spikes along its body, and it had a bony tail club at the end of its tail, like a lot of other ankylosaurs around that time. And some other ankylosaurs, like the group known as the nodosaurs, didn't have any tail clubs at all. They relied just on their bony armor and a row of spikes along their sides. So Spicomelis is kind of an anomaly for ankylosaurs because it is so much more armored. This means that after Spicomelis, ankylosaurs lost some of their armor, and this has led researchers to believe that the spikes of Spicomelis weren't necessarily used for defense. Although they were very good for it, they might have been used more for display purposes, for fighting off rivals or attracting mates. And shortly after the existence of Spicomelis came a new group of predatory dinosaurs known as the tyrannosaurs, and they were eventually very large bone-crushing predators, and for animals like ankylosaurs, they might have needed to forego the spiky displays for the more heavily armored osteoderms that the later species are known for. Spicomelis was also unique for ankylosaurs in that its osteoderms were fused directly to its bones, which is not really a thing for ankylosaurs. Most ankylosaur osteoderms are embedded in their muscles, so that shows that early ankylosaurs were much more experimental on an evolutionary level with their armor and how it developed and worked with their bodies. Another really interesting species of dinosaur was announced in August, this time a type of iguanodontian from the early Cretaceous period about 125 million years ago, known as Istiorhacus macarthurae. Istiorhacus lived in England and was roughly the same size as an American bison, a few meters long and weighing around a ton, and it was closely related to other dinosaurs like the famous iguanodon. But what makes it really unique for this group of dinosaurs is the sail-like structure along its back and tail from elongated neural spines. These spines would have supported either a sail or a crest along its midline, and it's been determined that this was likely used for display purposes. Such sail structures are rare for the iguanodontian dinosaurs, and these extreme neural spines give us a better understanding of just the overall diversity in the generic body plan for several different groups of dinosaurs. Due to the nature of the neural spines of Istiorachis being relatively similar to some modern reptiles, it's been proposed that this sail was used less for something like fat storage and more for visual display, whether for intimidating rivals, attracting mates, or social communications, or identifying individuals from individuals. We're not sure on that front, but that's what we think this sail was used for. Outside of the uniqueness of the sail for Istiorachis, its discovery tells us that the Isle of Wight, where it was originally unearthed, was a lot more diverse in iguanodontian dinosaurs than we previously assumed, showing that the environment was able to support a wide diversity of the same group of dinosaurs. Moving away from the dinosaurs, we can talk about other reptiles of the Mesozoic period, including a discovery of a new species of Tanystrophed. Tanystrophids were a unique group of reptiles, distantly related to birds, dinosaurs, and crocodilians. They had a very interesting body design. Their body design was really interesting. They had 4 limbs splayed out to their sides, and the majority of their body length was taken up by a ridiculously long neck. This new species, named Achitostrophus, lived in what is now Arizona during the Triassic period, around 223 to 218 million years ago. And Achitostrophus is an early diverging member of this group of reptiles, and it lived in freshwater swampy environments compared to later species which seem to have preferred more coastal marine environments. Achitostrophus represents one of the earlier diverging members of this group of reptiles, showing that the Tanystrophids were experimenting evolutionarily with their unique body plan earlier than previously assumed. And something else about Achitostrophus made it unique amongst Tanystrophids themselves. While Achitostrophus is represented by a small and fragmentary find, the fossils that we have of it consist of its neck vertebrae, and the vertebrae have this odd spine-like projection coming out of it, showing that the Tanystrophids were experimenting possibly with some unique defense structure that apparently didn't really play out, as no other later Tanystrophids had this, and it shows that Achitostrophus for its time was really unique because no other reptile from this part of the Triassic has this feature in its neck bone. Overall, Achitostrophus is just a unique type of already unique group of reptiles, and it shows that there's a lot more to discover overall as we look at the ancient past. Moving on from semi-aquatic ancient reptiles that are not dinosaurs, we'll move further into the marine aspect of reptile evolution, where scientists have made 2 discoveries of a plesiosaur and an ichthyosaur. First up is Plesionectes longicolum, a small species of early plesiosaur with the longest neck of its time. It was a small plesiosaur measuring around 10 feet in length and lived about 184 to 174 million years ago during the Lower Jurassic period. But what's super unique about it is just its neck overall, which had 43 vertebrae in it. This gave it one of the longest necks of any plesiosaur that lived alongside it, and it now represents the oldest plesiosaur from Germany, where it was initially uncovered. Of course, a new species shows that the plesiosaurs were more diverse than previously assumed, but it also shows that plesiosaurs were evolving their longer necks in at least some species earlier than we previously thought. Plesionectes lived during the early Torsian stage of the Lower Jurassic period, which was an interesting time ecologically. There was a lot of climate events going on and oceanic and anoxic events happening, and the discovery of Plesionectes helps us better understand how some groups of animals were adapting to a changing environment. Moving on to the ichthyosaur that was announced in August, this is Platypterygius australis, an exceptionally well-preserved ichthyosaur from Australia. Dating back to about 100 million years ago, measuring about 7 meters in length, this fossil represents one of the most well-preserved ichthyosaurs ever found. At 90% completed, it is the most well-completed ichthyosaur found in Australia for sure. The fossil includes the entire skull and torso, the entire vertebral column, the left front flipper, the right rear flipper, which is really rare, and the caudal tail, which gives us a huge amount of insight into how not just this species of ichthyosaur, but ichthyosaurs as a group operated in their ocean environment. The preservation of this fossil will let us look at skeletal anatomy, growth rate, and other factors of this species, which will help us better understand the ichthyosaurs as a whole. While Platypterygius was not the largest ichthyosaur ever discovered, it's still roughly the size of the average orca, and it was an apex predator of its environment, likely feeding on a wide variety of fish, squid, and other smaller marine organisms. And again, because of how complete it is, it'll allow us to better understand how this predator lived in its environment and how it likely behaved as it moved around the oceans. And this fossil in particular is being prepared for public display in a museum in 2026. Which will give all of us a chance to go see one of the most well-complete ichthyosaurs ever found. Moving on from individual studies, we can talk about a series of really interesting studies that were published by an international team of paleontologists of a series of fossils that were discovered across 3 African basins dating back to about 250 million years ago, just before the greatest mass extinction event in the history of the planet, the Great Dying. These studies are the culmination of over 15 years of field work and cover a wide range of fossils discovered across these 3 African basins. A bunch of new species were discovered, including several Gorgonopsians, the saber-toothed predators of the Permian period, the burrowing herbivorous Dicynodonts that lived alongside the Gorgonopsians, and a group of ancient amphibians known as Temdospondals, which are close relatives to salamanders. The diversity of the species that are discussed in these studies highlights a really rich and diverse range of animals that lived before the time of the Great Dying, where 90% of all life on the planet went extinct. Another important aspect of these studies is the locations of the fieldwork conducted. Most of our understanding of the End-Permian life before and during the Great Dying comes from the Karoo Basin in Africa, but these studies were conducted in the Ruhuhu Basin, the Langwa Basin, and the Mid-Zambezi Basins, giving us independent and geologically diverse areas of study, giving us a much broader understanding of life just before the Great Dying and during that die-off. These discoveries and the diversity of the discoveries will allow scientists to get a much better understanding of how the Great Dying affected specific lineages of life on the continent of Pangaea, as well as get an understanding of which lineages were actually able to make it through and then diversify in the wake of the Great Dying before the dinosaurs appear on the scene. The discoveries also show that southern Pangaea was a lot wetter and lusher than we might have assumed previously, which just gives us a better understanding of the supercontinent and what its environments were like before the big breakup into the continents that we now know today. Now we're going to jump forward to just a little bit after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, about 56 million years ago, during one of the fastest warming events in Earth's climate history, to look at how a species of mammal was adapting to that changing environment. So 56 million years ago lived an animal called Dissacus, which was a type of Mesonychid, a now extinct group of predatory and omnivorous mammal that started to gain prominence shortly after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. So 56 million years ago, the Earth experienced the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, one of the fastest, naturally rapid warming events in Earth's history. And the team of researchers were looking at the teeth of Dissacus. Specifically, they were using a technique called dental microwear texture analysis to look at the pits and scratches of the teeth of these specimens to understand what the animals were eating shortly before they died. And they looked at specimens dating to before this thermal maximum and after the thermal maximum. So the researchers found that before the PETM, Dissacus teeth had wear similar to modern cheetahs, indicating that they were eating tough flesh of their prey. But during and after the PETM, the tooth wear of Dissacus matched more closely with lions and hyenas, indicating that they were crunching harder material like bones. This dietary change is likely a result of the scarcity of their usual prey items brought on by the thermal maximum itself. Alongside the PETM, there was a minor extinction event likely caused because of the warming event. The PETM was also pretty quick, and it only lasted about 200,000 years, and the adaptations that Dissacus went through can help us maybe better understand how modern mammalian predators are going to adapt today due to our human influence speeding up our current climate crisis. Of course, Dissacus and the rest of the Mesonychids still went extinct shortly after the PETM, showing that even the most adaptable of animals are going to eventually succumb if conditions are pushed too far. But we have a better understanding of what at least some animals were doing during a rapid warming event in Earth's history. But finally, we are going to wrap up the August Paleo Rewind with a much closer to home discovery of one of our ancient relatives, Australopithecus. So an international team of researchers released a major study revolving around a baker's dozen teeth discovered in Ethiopia dating back to about 2.6 to 2.8 million years ago, and they represent a new species of an already known genus of hominid called Australopithecus. What's really important about this study is the age of the fossils, 2.6 to 2.8 million years old, younger by a couple 100,000 years of other Australopithecus specimens, showing that the lineage survived into the more recent past than we previously assumed, showing that hominin evolution is more complex than we previously thought. Most people accidentally tend to think of human evolution as kind of a straight line from ape to upright ape to human, and that's not the case. Like all other animal lineages, human evolution is a bushy tree, not a straight branch, and this new species of Australopithecus just helps reinforce that understanding. Now, it's also important to note that these teeth are not being formally named as a new species of Australopithecus because of the nature of their preservation and the limited understanding that we can gather from these teeth. But either way, whether it's a new species or part of, say, Australopithecus afarensis, it still shows that the genus was able to survive further than we previously thought, helping to understand our evolution along with our distant ancestors and our more recent relatives that no longer exist. If it is named as a new species, it places it closer to the divergence of our Homo genus with our Australopithecus ancestors, and will help us better understand where we come from and where we fit in the evolutionary tree of life.
Have you ever heard the phrase being hard-headed? Well, our first September discovery didn't know how to be any other way. Coming to us from the Gobi Desert, Zavacephalae was a pachycephalosaur from the early Cretaceous of Mongolia, living about 108 to 110 million years ago. The name comes from, and apologies if I completely fail at these pronunciations and pronunciations going forward, comes from the Tibetan word for origin, Zava, and precious one, Rinpoche, with the Latin for head, the fowl. This new dome-headed dinosaur is special for a couple of reasons. First, it's remarkably well preserved. The skull of Zavacephalae is nearly complete, making it the most complete pachycephalosaur skull ever found. The fossil also has extensive postcranial material and appears to be an immature individual, meaning that it hadn't grown to its full size. The skull of Zavacephalae suggests that these bones of pachycephalosaurs grew more quickly than the rest of their bodies. This is something that has been a point of debate when studying pachyontogeny for ages. This new dino also pushes back our understanding of pachycephalosaur dinosaur origin millions of years. It is the oldest pachycephalosaur known, directly from the abstract, quote, phylogenetic analysis recovered see Rinpoche as one of the earliest diverging pachycephalosaurians, pushing back the fossil evidence of the frontoparietal dome by at least 14 million years. That's pretty dang cool.
Hi, and welcome to Paleo Rewind 2025.
Oh my god, go put clothes on first.
Right, sorry. Welcome to Paleo Rewind 2025, an annual event hosted by Edge Science.
Woo woo. This year, he's asked us to cover some of the most notable paleontological discoveries from the spookiest of months, October.
His mistake, really. We'll start at the beginning and work our way to the end of the month, discussing papers in the order in which they were published. Which means you have to wait until the end. Don't make me invalidate you again.
Yeah, anyway, without further ado, let's move on from whatever that is and dig into October.
October was kicked off with some good old-fashioned lizard research. Now, everyone who knows me knows I love lizards.
It's true, hell, his daughter's a lizard.
So obviously I was excited to see October start out with a new paper by Benson et al. Describing a new Jurassic lizard.
And he's not just saying that because Roger Benson is one of the professors he applied with for his PhD.
Hey, shut up. But seriously, Raj, baby, call me.
The 167-million-year-old lizard, which Benson et al. Have dubbed Brugnathair, we're going to go with that, Brugnathair elongensis, or however you say it, sorry, I don't speak Gaelic, was described from a disarticulated skeleton found in Scotland.
Brugnathair represents one of the oldest known fossil squamates, the group that includes all lizards, including snakes, and was placed in an all-new family of extinct lizards, the Parviraptoridae.
This early lizard is described as a mosaic in that it possesses several traits associated with several lizard lineages, such as the head and bodily proportions of a monitor lizard, the teeth and jaws of a snake, and several features thought to be more primitive to lizards that are seen in geckos.
You hear that, buddy? That might be your great times several million grandparent. Right now, it's unclear whether Brugnathair is an ancestor to specifically toxicophoran lizards like monitors, snakes, and iguanas, or something more basal that might be ancestral to my little leopard gecko, Darwin. But what is for sure is that this paves the way for a lot of really cool lizard research in the future.
Adasaurs!
They are weird.
Known well to lay audiences as the dinosaurs with the short but strong jaws and comically short arms that make T-Rex look like Arnold Schwarzenegger, such as Carnotaurus and Majungasaurus, this October, the bulldogs of the dinosaurs received a new addition to the fam.
On October 2nd, Valandia et al. Introduced us to Vitasaura Colozicani, how do you say it? It's Vitasaura!
While Vitasaura was named off of fragmentary remains, which we typically find to provide questionable justification for a new taxon, it actually represents the first theropod overall from the Cretaceous Los Llanos formation of Argentina's La Rioja province.
It also possesses several traits that are associated with multiple lineages of Abelisaurs, which typically indicates something new.
I think he's back.
Oh, god damn it! I think we better take this show on the road. He's just getting too impatient.
Yeah, agreed.
Welcome to the mighty Delaware River. The very river that George Washington crossed with his men in the dead of winter because he's a fucking psychopath. And home to a wide diversity of fish.
About 2/3 of these fish all belong to the largest group of freshwater fish known today, the odophysans, which were long thought to have originated in freshwater prior to the breakup of Pangaea.
Until October 2nd of this year, when a paper by Liu et al. Pulled a bitch you thought.
Liu and his team used a combination of morphological and genomic data, with new information pulled from a new late Cretaceous odophysan fossil, to demonstrate that the group likely originated much later than previously thought, in the late Jurassic, or even in the early Cretaceous.
Additionally, the ancient dispersal of these fish being present on all continents, even after Pangaea began to split, coupled with the results of their phylogenetic analyses, implied that their origins weren't even freshwater, but rather marine, and that the two major subgroups within Odophysii actually adapted to freshwater independently of one another. I've always loved birds. My grandpa used to take me birding when I was a kid. But one of my favorite groups of birds is one that I've never been fortunate enough to see, the bowerbirds. One day.
Bowerbirds live in Australia and that part of the world, Max. Come on, get your bird facts right.
Huh. Well, I guess that explains why I've never seen one. In spite of what this hat, which is incontestably better than yours, might have you thinking, I've never been to Australia.
Wait, did you just switch hats?
Huh? No, I don't know what you're talking about.
Anyway, Max has had bowerbirds on the brain as of late because of a new paper published by Steele et al. On October 7th.
Oh yes, Steele and her team found evidence of Miocene bowerbirds in New Zealand. Kinda sick.
You'll recognize bowerbirds as those house-building birds from the David Attenborough documentaries. A newly published specimen dubbed Aviperdidus gracilis, which is represented by a 19 to 15 million year old leg bone called a tarsa metatarsus, demonstrated several traits that we associate with modern bowerbirds.
But this leg bone was notably proportionally longer and overall smaller than any seen in modern bowerbirds, so the researchers suggested it may belong to an early or even stem member of the group.
Wait, do you hear that?
Oh shit, I think he caught up with us.
Damn it, back to the car!
Get it? Like, because we're on shit, because the rock is shit. A study published on October 9th introduced us to a new species of ichthyosaur from the early Jurassic, and I bet you'll never guess who the lead author is.
Anyone keeping tally on new species of ichthyosaur these days won't be surprised to hear that this research was helmed by none other than Dean Lomax.
Arguably the president, or rather prime minister, of ichthyosaur research at this point, and kind of a celebrity in his own right.
Why don't you go kiss him if he's so cool?
Don't tempt me.
Focus on the road, smartass. This new marine reptile, which has been named Xiphodracon goldencapensis, possesses several unique traits among ichthyosaurs, such as a lacrimal bone with prong-like projections, additional projections on the prefrontal bone, wedge-shaped external nares, and most notably, an extremely long and slender snout.
These traits allowed Dr. Lomax and crew to put Xiphodracon into a new group of ichthyosaurs called the Hophteopterygia.
The Triassic was a weird time for dinosaurs.
And in fact, it was the first time for dinosaurs. Here, come check this out.
Many things about the Triassic and the origin of dinosaurs remain a great mystery.
But sites like this small Triassic outcrop help us solve those mysteries bit by bit. That's what Heikenleitner, I hardly know her, et al. Did with an early Argentinian relative of the long-necked dinosaurs in their publication from October 15th.
Introducing Hoyrecursor jaguensis, a sauropodomorph from the Santo Domingo Formation of northwest Argentina.
This early relative of Littlefoot and Dino was found in a bone bed along with lots of weird Triassic critters. But the dinosaur in particular stood out to the scientists for the fact that it fills gaps in the early long-neck family tree.
In particular, the size and shape of this dinosaur's neck vertebrae indicate a blend of characteristics typically independently associated with the two groups of early sauropodomorphs, which seems to indicate the beginning of a trajectory towards the eventual gargantuan sizes of their descendants. Okay, I think it's safe to say we lost him.
Hey, isn't that your mom's apartment building?
Yeah, I guess we can just hang out here for a bit.
A paleoanthropological paper by Archer et al. From October 22nd did the unthinkable. It gave due cultural credit to a people who aren't white.
Breaking from the absurd but long-held assumption that ancient Australian First Peoples culture starts and stops with hunting, the researchers came to bat for this ancient but still present cultural group by suggesting that not every mark on extinct megafauna bones were butcher marks. And in fact, some may have resulted from fossil collecting.
After reanalyzing the tibia of a short-faced kangaroo from Mammoth Cave, the Australian one, not the American National Park, previously thought to have been killed by early Australian peoples, Archer and his co-authors were able to use micro-CT scanning and microscopic analyses to determine that the cuts to the bone not only probably happened after the animal had been dead for some time, but even after it had begun to fossilize.
But it doesn't stop there. Teeth of a giant diprotodont called Zygomaturus were gifted by the first peoples of the Kimberley region to earlier researchers, and an additional Pleistocene kangaroo tooth was also gifted to them by the Warara First Peoples. It's likely that these teeth had been in the possession of the first people from these regions for thousands of years, but the researchers who initially studied them suggested they came from animals killed in those regions.
But Archer et al. Conducted new X-ray fluorescence analyses and found that the mineralogy of the tooth did not match the mineralogy of the fossils in the Kimberley region, and noted that these species were in fact never thought to have lived there at all, for the lack of any other fossil evidence to suggest so.
Instead, the X-ray chemical analyses indicated that the teeth came from Mammoth Cave, almost 3,000 kilometers to the south, and a month-long walk with modern trail and roadway systems and no stops. This means that the people who initially collected the teeth from Mammoth Cave valued them enough to carry them thousands of kilometers.
Further review of other instances of butchered megafauna bones were actually also examples of fossils that had been discovered and transported thousands of years ago by First Peoples. This indicates that fossils may have actually been very culturally important to early Australian peoples.
Speaking of prior assumptions worthy of new challenges, you may have heard the rumor that while the big 10-kilometer space rock was the final nail in the coffin, the dinosaurs were going extinct anyway.
This interpretation of the death of the dinos stems from the seemingly sharp drop in dino diversity in End-Cretaceous rock formations like those in the northern Great Plains.
But this doesn't really account for diversity in other regions, which haven't been given as strong a consideration. Enter Flynn et al. On October 23rd with a new paper on End-Cretaceous dinosaur diversity in southern North America.
You'd think at some point Americans would learn that you can't base a whole worldview off one region, but alas, here we are.
Flynn and his team focused on biodiversity in the Nacho Ibito member of the Ojo Alamo Formation in New Mexico, which represents the time just before the asteroid impact, and compared it to other formations from well-studied regions with both older and younger fossil assemblages.
They found that diversity was still pretty high at the end of the Cretaceous, but that species tended to stay in their preferred ecosystem rather than every species expanding all the way across the continent, a concept called endemism.
This makes a lot more sense than prior assumptions, because regional biodiversity resulting from endemism is the standard for modern species diversity. And it turns out that previous studies had already demonstrated that ecoregions had begun diversifying towards the end of the Campanian, the stage right before the Maastrichtian, which was the final stage of the non-bird dinosaurs.
This trend of diversifying ecoregions, which Flynn et al. Call provinciality, continued into the Maastrichtian and likely explains why specific regions seem less diverse, even though overall diversity remained comparable to earlier parts of the Cretaceous. So it turns out the dinosaurs weren't just evolutionary failures after all.
What can we say? Guess you gotta have them skills to survive a giant space rock.
What?
Being a generalist is the name of the game, baby. This crocodile isn't a crocodile.
Actually, it's a close relative of crocodiles called a Dinosaur, which is a crocodiliform, but dinosaurs are not crocodiles.
Confused yet? So are we. Just kidding. Let us explain. The crocodiliforms are what are more commonly referred to as crocodilians, which includes a lot of animals which are not crocodiles, such as Dinosaurs, Sarcosuchus, Deinosuchus, alligators, and gharials. However, all modern crocodilians fall within a subgroup of crocodiliforms called Eusuchians, while Dinosaurs were in a completely different group called Tethasuchians. Basically, all crocodiles are Eusuchians, but not all Eusuchians are crocodiles, and all Eusuchians are crocodilians, but not all crocodilians are Eusuchians, such as in the case of Dinosaurs, not to be confused with dinosaurs, none of which are crocodilians. Makes perfect sense, right? Not confusing at all.
And it's one of those almost but not quite crocodiles that was described by Saber.
Sick-ass name, BT dubs. Like, Dr. Saber? What? That's so cool. She should name her kid Light.
And her team discovering that it was an early diverging dirosaurid from the Middle Campanian Cousier Formation of Egypt in a paper published on October 27th.
This was big news in the dirosaurid world because early dirosaurid evolutionary history remains poorly understood due to a significant fossil gap during the late Cretaceous.
But this new species, named Wadasuchus casabi, has transitional cranial features, including reduced premaxillary alveoli, modified occlusion patterns, and dorsally positioned external nares that help shed light on some of the aspects of cranial evolution in early dirosaurids.
This may support an earlier transatlantic dispersal of the group than what was previously thought, but more research is needed to attain more certain conclusions. Now we finally get to talk about one of my all-time favorite topics, fossil mammals. Now, if you know me, you know I'm a mammal guy. Well, really, we're all mammal guys if you think about it. So I was pretty pumped to hear about the new paper published by Fraser et al. On October 28th, naming a new species of 23-million-year-old rhino.
Right off the bat, this is a really significant discovery, and it's represented by a complete skeleton, which, if you don't know, is kind of rare in paleo. It extends the duration of its genus by millions of years, and it's the highest latitude rhino ever found.
But that's not even the coolest part. This rhino tells a complex and intricate story, but we'll get to that.
First, let us introduce you to this new species, Epiaceratherium itgiluk. This species name itgiluk means frost or frosty, in reference to the fact that this guy was found in the high Arctic of Canada. And it's a name that was chosen in collaboration with an elder from the most northern Inuit community in Canada. Paleontologists take note, we should be doing a lot more of this instead of naming every new species after the same 5 dead white guys. Just saying.
Exactly. Snaps. And on top of doing a great job naming this critter, Fraser and her team had plenty of justification here to name a new species, because this specimen displays all sorts of unique anatomical characteristics for this genus, especially in its teeth.
But wait, there's more! The authors conducted phylogenetic analyses too, which brought to light interesting implications about rhino dispersal.
Specifically, their dispersal across the North Atlantic land bridge, which used to connect Europe to North America during warm periods over the last 66 million years, and therefore allowed land animals to migrate and move between continents.
But here's the catch. Before this rhino brought new evidence to light, paleontologists had concluded that terrestrial vertebrates did not disperse back and forth across the land bridge anytime after the early Eocene.
With a new species on their hands, these researchers conducted biogeographical analyses and found that it's likely that multiple dispersals between Europe and North America occurred in both directions during the Oligocene and even the Miocene.
Meaning that the North Atlantic land bridge might have been crossable to land animals 20 million years longer than was previously thought. I mean, you have to love it when new research adds a new piece to the puzzle.
I mean, I totally agree. This research is so cool, and I feel like it would have gotten a lot more attention too if it weren't for... Guess we couldn't avoid this forever.
Nanotyrannus is valid.
Nanotyrannus is valid. Nanotyrannus is valid, Baxter!
Nanotyrannus is valid!
Oh my god, Nanotyrannus is valid! You know, actually, I don't really give a shit. Suppose the audience needs the background on the drama to understand why people made such a big deal out of this.
Okay, so, in 1946, Charles Gilmore first described a specimen as a new species of Gorgosaurus, naming it Gorgosaurus lancensis. But then, a 1965 paper by a Soviet paleontologist named Rojdeskvensky, I think, suggested this specimen might be a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex. But given that he was a Soviet, publishing about an American dinosaur in the mid-1960s, it didn't make much of a splash in the world of American tyrannosaurid research. Fast forward to 1988, and research by Bakker et al. Reassigns the lancensis species to a new tyrannosaur genus, Nanotyrannus, which Bakker and his co-authors believe to be a mature specimen and not a juvenile T-Rex.
If you thought this was settled, think again. A decade later in 1999, a paper by Carr et al. Provided new analysis demonstrating that the specimen was in fact not an adult, but a juvenile. Carr suggested that, given no adults had ever been found and that it shared an ecosystem with Tyrannosaurus rex, it was likely that this animal was a juvenile T-Rex, especially considering that, at the time, juvenile T-Rex material was not abundant.
Enter several decades of infighting among tyrannosaur researchers. It often got pretty heated, and each camp hurled papers at one another with as much venom as they hurled their insults. It was messy, but it all kept coming back to the same issue. If Nanotyrannus is valid, where are all the adults? After all, the Hell Creek and Lance formations were abundant with T-Rex. So if a second Tyrannosaur was present in these ecosystems, then why weren't we finding them?
That is, until 2006, when commercial fossil salesman Clayton Phipps found two extraordinarily complete dinosaurs who seemed to have died right next to each other, a Triceratops and a juvenile T-Rex. Phipps outsourced fossil preparation to CK Preparations and began trying to sell the fossil in 2011 with the help of controversial fossil salesman Pete Larson. In 2013, Larson declared that the juvenile T-Rex was in fact the first adult specimen of Nanotyrannus. This, of course, was met with much backlash from paleontologists. After a several-year-long legal dispute over the land boundaries where the specimens were discovered, they ended up at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, where preparation on the fossil was completed and research was begun by their curator, Dr. Lindsay Zano.
In the time since then, attempts have been made to validate Nanotyrannus, some by Larson, but none of those attempts settled the issue. Because of the seeming lack of evidence and the lack of support by leading paleontologists, we were actually anti-nano ourselves.
That is, until we took a research visit to the North Carolina Museum in December of 2024, where we saw the specimen in person and had our minds changed on the issue after discussing the now abundant evidence with the museum staff. The museum's collections manager asked us to keep what we saw quiet until the paper was published. And so we did, because we're good little scientists.
On October 30th of this year, the day before Halloween, Dr. Zano and her co-author James Napoli dropped the bombshell.
And the reaction was non-controversial, to the surprise of literally everybody. After years of venom and debate over slim evidence on either side, much of which amounted to anecdote, Zano's team managed to present the world with the first research soundly demonstrating the validity of Nanotyrannus. And the scientific community sat down and took a deep breath. This was the scientific evidence that the debate needed, and in a snap, everyone finally chilled.
First of all, the specimen at the North Carolina Museum was undoubtedly an adult, and it revealed that Nanotyrannus had more teeth than Tyrannosaurus, longer arms, and, according to the lines of arrested growth in the cross-section of their bones, a much shallower growth curve, likely as a result of having less growing to do in their life.
And it doesn't end there. The traits that separate Nanotyrannus from T-Rex also appeared on the most famous juvenile T-Rex specimen, Jane, at the Burpee Museum in Rockford, Illinois. But Jane also has some separate traits from the dueling dinosaurs Nano, which actually indicated that Jane was a second species of Nanotyrannus, which Zano named Nanotyrannus lithaeus.
This, of course, was a major win for women in science because, naturally, after decades of bickering in the Tyrannosaur Boys Club, a woman calmly walked in and settled the whole argument. As it turns out, the boys were just too emotional.
Exactly. See, this is why I love you.
Thank you all so much for joining us on this Paleo Rewind adventure, and if you like our style, go ahead and hit that like button and the subscribe button if you're feeling funky, and stick around for a while.
And feel free to drop any questions you might have in the comments. We'll do our best to answer.
We also want to give another huge shout out to Edge Science for inviting us to be part of the fun this year, and to tell you to go check out the other channels that are doing Paleo Rewind this year along with us. Linked below.
And most of all, we want to say a huge thank you to all the incredible paleontologists out there who are publishing really great work and helping to progress our field.
Yes, seriously, you guys are awesome. And I guess we can say thanks to Nanotyrannus for being valid.
Yeah, I mean, even I admit, Nano made this video kind of fun.
How's it going, everybody? I hope everybody's had a wonderful holiday. Today, it's time for me to take a step back to doing Paleo Rewind for the first time since, I don't know, 2022? I actually had to go look. No, wait, never mind. I did do 2023. Feels like it's been longer than that, though. All right, yeah, I did April in 23, and then I did November in 22. I don't know. I tend to pick this month because it's my birth month, but also I feel like a lot of the new discoveries tend to pick up for whatever reason in the latter half of the year. But what was pretty ironic was when I looked at the new publications for the month of November this year, although I couldn't have possibly predicted this, it was a big month for discoveries that are directly related to things that I have been talking about quite a bit this year. A lot of things having to do with, of all things, Triassic animals. So this is actually an excellent opportunity for me to give some updates to some of the things that I didn't get to cover in the history of the Earth, because, well, we didn't know about that stuff yet. I was going to also cover that new Arctic rhino that was discovered around this time of the year as well, since I have been covering North American rhinos quite a bit. But it turns out that was actually published at the very tail end of October, so that was part of Geosplore's month. And before I get into November's discoveries, I want to talk for a little bit about Geosplores. I've been following Max and Madison on Instagram for quite a while, and I just have to say, they are some of the most fun, entertaining, and talented science communicators that I have had the privilege of meeting. I actually did get to meet them at the Sternberg Museum earlier this year. They're both really fantastic people who I would love to see grow their following here on YouTube just as much as they have on Instagram. So if you haven't yet, I'll leave a link in the description to their channel. I absolutely think that you should go check them out. And who knows, maybe one day you might even see me collaborate with them. They are, after all, fellow hunters of the White River Badlands, so I think there'd be a lot that we could talk about. But now, it's time to go back. Back to November of 2025, and back to the Triassic.
You can't be serious.
Yep, we're going back again.
Every time I get out, they keep pulling me back in!
The first discovery takes us back to a few million years before the Carnian Pluvial event transformed Pangaea. If you remember, at this time life was going through one of the most challenging periods in Earth's history. The world was attempting to recover from the most devastating mass extinction ever, and what was left was an arid, flat land with deserts stretching across the greatest supercontinent that has ever formed. But life was still hanging on. And in May of this year, a new genus was found in southern Brazil that could actually fill a gap in our understanding. It was discovered in May, but it wasn't reported on until November, because publications take time. So we've talked a lot about the Pseudosuchians, a clade of archosaurs that have often been referred to as land crocs, or rather, one of the types of land crocs that have existed. They were the dominant carnivores all across Pangaea during the Triassic. But we have mentioned before that one branch of this clade was particularly confusing: the poposaurs, a group of animals that, despite having a lot of similarities to the carnivorous dinosaurs like theropods and the herrerasaurs, they were different enough to know that these are not dinosaurs. There was always too many differences in the skeleton to put them in that clade. We knew that they were some kind of archosaur, but we couldn't figure out exactly where they fit. But with the new species Tanracuasuchus, we may be one step closer to solving this mystery. Found in the Santa Maria Formation in the Dinodontosaurus assemblage zone, and dated to around 240 million years ago. This entire formation paints a very different picture of this land in the dry, desolate time before the rains came, because we find a great deal of diversity here. This, along with another discovery that we'll get into in a little bit, pays testament to how hardy life in the Triassic truly was. Now, Tanracuasuchus was not the largest carnivore on the landscape. At about 2.5 meters long and around 60 kilograms, it was filling the mid-sized predator role. It had a nimble body and a narrow jaw, along with a slightly longer neck than some of the other land crocs that it shared its environment different with. And it also shared a lot of traits with an African pseudosuchian from Tanzania called Mandasuchus. But all of these other features seem to make it at least somewhat similar to a poposaur. Now, with all the continents connected at the time, it's not such a big stretch to the imagination for a terrestrial animal to be able to spread from Africa to South America. And it should be noted that even though this animal is thought to be an early poposaur, it's thought to not yet have evolved the upright bipedal stance that would make later members of this clade, like Poposaurus and Smock, such a confusing Triassic enigma. This animal could serve as a missing link between some of the earlier land crocs and the group that convergently evolved a very dinosaur-like gait without actually being dinosaurs. Next up, we're going to get into kind of a twofer, because in the same week we saw 2 different discoveries from 2 different fossil sites that give us even more information about marine life in the Triassic. The first one coming from an island called Spitsbergen within the Arctic Ocean. This site turned out to be a super rich bone bed dating back to around 250 million years ago. So literally right after the Great Dying. We have known for a long time how many different groups of vertebrates moved into the coastal and marine habitats at this time. But this site gave us a really good idea of exactly how quickly the marine diversity really bounced back. In just 2 to 3 million years, we see sharks, lobe-finned fish, saltwater adapted temnospondyls, a plethora of different semi-aquatic marine reptiles along the coast, and perhaps most interestingly, a large assortment of ichthyosaurs. Some of them adapted for crushing shells and then also moving quickly into the apex predator role in their environment. Like, for the time, this was a very diverse ecosystem. Keep in mind, on land, this was the age of Lystrosaurus, where 75% of the terrestrial vertebrates left alive were this guy. But as bad as the Permian extinction was on land, it was even worse in the oceans. Life in the oceans was 96% wiped out by the Permian extinction. So it kind of makes sense that there was so many animals moving in to take up the vacant niches that were left available. And this sets the stage for the other discovery we're going to talk about in this section. A new species of Nothosaur from southwestern China, called Lijangosaurus. This partial skeleton, which was dated to around 8 to 10 million years after the start of the Triassic and the big explosion of marine life found on Spitsbergen Island, is interesting because even though it was a Nothosaur, and in fact an early Nothosaur at that, it had an extremely long neck, which is a feature that we generally think of as something that evolved in the plesiosaurs, the descendants of the Nothosaurs. And because we already know that the plesiosaurs descended from some of these more standard-looking members of this order, that means that this feature evolved twice independently from different members of this group. And if you count Tanystropheus, the long-necked reptile I've mentioned in several videos, that makes 3 separate instances of aquatic reptiles evolving this body shape around the same time, with a small head with teeth perfect for catching fish at the end of a long neck. And they were all right around the same size too, at right around 7 or 8 feet long. Now, the main difference between something like this guy and Tanystropheus is if you look at the skeleton of this one, which for the record is not even a Nothosaur at all. Its long neck is comprised of 10 cervical vertebrae. Because of this, its neck was not super flexible, at least not compared to some of these other ones. Because if you look at the neck of Lijangosaurus, its neck is comprised of 42 small vertebrae, which means that although these two animals kind of came out looking somewhat similar, they were not at all the same in a lot of ways, primarily in the way that they would have moved. And if anything, Lijangosaurus was more similar to later plesiosaurs that had insanely long and flexible necks like Elasmosaurus from the Cretaceous, which had over 70 neck vertebrae. But in the Triassic at least, there was obviously lots of ways to go fishing as a reptile, and November 2025 was a big month for increasing our understanding of that. Alright, so first we had a Triassic discovery of a land animal, then we had a few discoveries pertaining to marine life. Now it's time to get into a discovery that has to do with what was, at the time, one of the greatest leaps in evolution for the vertebrates. Because if you remember, the Triassic was also when we got the very first flying vertebrates, from that one branch of the archosaurs called the Avametatarsilia, which diverged into both the earliest dinosaurs and the pterosaurs. Now, we believe the ancestors of the flying reptiles were from a family of small, fleet-footed creatures called the Lagarpetids, the ones that I said look like some sort of a reptilian spring hare, with species like Dromaeomeron and Scaloromochlus. Now, despite these being fairly small, lightly built animals, we actually have a couple of really nice specimens of them, including skulls that have a pretty intact brain case. And scientists were able to do in-depth scans of these brain cases to compare them to the brains of several other types of animals, like the non-avian dinosaurs, birds, several other reptiles, and the pterosaurs that we believe they gave rise to. Now, for those who don't know, even though pterosaurs and birds are both lineages of archosaurs that evolved flight, they did so completely separately, and mechanically how they managed this was very, very different. But this gave us a chance to look at how their brains evolved as they took to the air, and the results were actually pretty surprising. Now, one thing that we assumed would be pretty universal was the rapid development of the optic lobe, the region of the brain that's dedicated to processing visual information, because, you know, it's pretty important for a flyer. And that ended up being the case. But oddly enough, when we compare the brains of pterosaurs to all these other groups, besides that one similarity, the group of animals who they came out most similarly to was actually the non-avian dinosaurs. And there was actually a lot of differences between the brains of pterosaurs and birds. And perhaps even more interestingly, a lot of differences between the pterosaurs and their ancestors like Scaloromochlus. So here you can see a chart that kind of compares the brain development of the two flying lineage of archosaurs and how they evolved throughout the Mesozoic. Now, for one thing, the cerebral hemisphere ends up being much larger in birds, but overall, the birds were going through a much more gradual, consistent progression, while the pterosaurs' brains seemed to rapidly change after evolving flight. And I think that honestly, this is some of the most fascinating things that we can learn about any long extinct group of animals. Because if we can get an idea of how their brains were evolving, we can get a better understanding of how they interacted with their world. And this paints a picture of a group of animals that were very different from the flying animals of today. But this is also something that's going to take a lot more study to fully understand. It seems as though the pterosaurs were drastically different in almost every regard from the animals that we understand to be their ancestors. It was actually a really pleasant surprise to see how many new discoveries came out in the month of November that had to do with this time period that I've covered a lot on this channel. So much of my content has been focused on the Triassic period. So getting the chance to make this video and recap on some of the new discoveries that came out since I finished the big Triassic video earlier this year, I feel like this really gave me a chance to put a bookend on that chapter.
Since dinosaurs are my main forte, I figured it would be an excellent choice to start with none other than a new study on Diplodocus, or what we assume is Diplodocus. In a paper by Dr. Tess Gallagher and her team, melanosomes from a sauropod scale were studied in depth for the first time. Melanosomes are organelles that are responsible for the storage and transport of melanin in animal cells, and they control the color of the animal. Typically, we find them most often in fossilized feathers, which has allowed us to determine somewhat accurate feather color for a plethora of dinosaurs. In a select few dinosaurs, their skin and scales were preserved well enough that we could do the same, analyzing their structure to determine the color of the animal. It's been done before on incredibly well-preserved animals like Borealopelta and Ornithischian, but outside of feathered dinosaurs and a few like that, no others have been determined until now. Fossils of what we believe are from Diplodocus were used in this study, and I say believe because the Morrison Formation is notorious for its variety of sauropods. As of right now, current analysis places it under Diplodocus, but future studies from this site could reveal them as a different animal altogether. altogether. Regardless of their identity, this study looked at the preserved skin of these creatures, revealing two distinct shapes of melanosomes, an oblong and a disc shape. That itself is rather significant because we haven't found multiple types of melanosomes in dinosaur scales before, only in feathers. The oblong shape, the easier and more common one to diagnose, is almost what we expect to see. These melanosomes fall in line with almost the expected colors and would have produced black to reddish-brown colors in life. But it's the other melanosomes that are more significant, as those closely resemble platelet melanosomes found in birds. These type of cells in birds allows them to produce iridescent feathers. Now that being said, Gallagher did stress that this does not mean that sauropods like Diplodocus were iridescent. What it does mean is that they were capable of far more complex colors than we would typically imagine. So they'd be a little bit flashier than we'd expect. To determine the color of the melanosome, we need to look at the size, shape, and structure. Melanosomes of the same size and shape might produce a different color based on the structure they were built in or the arrangement they're placed in within the animal and vice versa. If melanosomes are the same shape, their arrangement and inner structure might still cause them to be different colors or produce a different pattern. Such is the case here, with both types of melanosomes sitting very close together in the animal. This was interpreted as possible speckled pattern of sorts based on the arrangement, and while this does not allow us to determine the exact color of the animal without further studies, it gives us a much clearer picture and opens the door for future discoveries. But the possible sauropod colors wasn't the only unexpected find this month. Mosasaurs are one of the most popular extinct non-dinosaur creatures today, in large part thanks to the Jurassic World movies and similar media. They were the terror of the open seas, hidden beneath the waves, but they were contained to the ocean and salt water, right? As it turns out, wrong, actually. Back in 2022, a mosasaur tooth was discovered in North Dakota, hundreds of miles from the shores of the western interior seaway. As part of this new study, it was determined that this tooth belonged to a large mosasaur named Prognathodon, though which species we aren't entirely sure. The tooth definitely seems to belong to a larger animal, which matches the largest 3 species in the group, all of which could reach upwards of 30 feet or 9 meters in length, as well as the type species, which could reach around 20 feet or 6 meters in length. Curiously, it was found amongst a plethora of other fossils at the site, including a multitude of terrestrial creatures like Tyrannosaurus and Edmontosaurus, along with a plethora of freshwater creatures, but not a single marine animal in sight. Now you might say, but DinoFax, couldn't it have been carried there or somehow ended up there through other means? Yeah, I suppose in theory it could, but that's where the rest of the study comes into play if you want to be patient. Despite being found so far away from the sea, there's a multitude of factors that the authors, led by Melanie During, had to consider. They analyzed the carbon, oxygen, and other isotopes found within the tooth, as well as other mosasaurine teeth that have been found in similar situation, miles away from the sea or oceans. The teeth found away from the seas were found to have a much larger carbon isotope value than any other mosasaur tooth known, which is more in line with a freshwater environment. The reason for this disparity is twofold. What they ate would raise the value of their carbon isotopes, but for most mosasaurs, this would be offset by them diving into the deep waters out at sea, which lowers it. These Prognathodon teeth shows the raised value of the prey they were eating, but does not decrease as would be expected from diving, retaining a higher concentration. Another factor they considered was the fact that other smaller mosasaurs have been found in freshwater environments already, which definitely lends support to this theory that the giants like Prognathodon could have done the same. Their analysis also suggests that the western interior seaway was becoming desalinated during the end of the Cretaceous, and many new brackish environments were formed with what's known as a halocline. For reference, haloclines are where the dense saltwater sits below a layer of lighter freshwater. As a result, it's theorized by During and the team that mosasaurs began to adapt to freshwater environments near the end of the Cretaceous, similar to bull sharks of the modern day, swimming upstream in fresh water. These freshwater mosasaurs would have been a top aquatic predator in these environments, outsizing the local crocodilians and likely even hunting dinosaurs and similar. Further studies will need to be done to determine exactly what these mosasaurs were doing there, but as of right now it seems at least that some of these giant marine lizards were far better adapted to life in freshwater than we could have ever imagined, and may have dominated the rivers. And when it comes to aquatic reptiles, few living are more famous today than the largest living snake, the green anaconda. Anacondas are pound for pound the heaviest snakes alive today, making them the largest despite others like the reticulated python being slightly longer. But anacondas are no slouch in that department either. Reported sightings of snakes upwards of 20 feet have occurred all throughout our history with them, but many of them have been anecdotal at best or publicity stunts at worst. Outside of a published study that reveals revealed a potential new anaconda species, a few specimens held in captivity, and a few measured in the field, few true giants have ever been found. While anacondas upwards of 25 feet could potentially be possible, it has long been theorized that, like crocodilians, human hunting of the animal would decrease their size over time, leading to an assumed bias with the lack of large specimens. However, this study and its recent fossils find that isn't the case. The origins of anacondas have been murky at best before now, with other fossils found that tentatively dated them near the end of the Miocene or later. These new fossils place them at over 12 million years old and much farther back in the Miocene, and they reveal that these snakes have been giants the whole time, but not particularly larger than the ones we have today. Back then, they were far more widespread across the entirety of northern South America, but they attained their giant sizes even then, with this new fossil being around 16 feet or 5 meters plus. At the time they first evolved, global temperatures were far warmer. Typically, this results in giants arising, as they did here. These ancient anacondas would have coexisted with some true giants, like the Cayman Purosaurus, one of the two largest crocodilians ever known as of today. The researchers, led by Andres Alfonso Rojas, expected to find giant anacondas like the stories would have you believe today, but what they found instead were the origins of this gigantism. The warmer temperatures at the time likely resulted in the rise of anacondas' giant body size in the first place, similar to their cousin Titanoboa millions of years prior. This means that anacondas have had the same body size since they first arose, though larger specimens may have been more common back then. Despite the massive changes to their environment over the last 12 million years, there has remained enough large prey to keep these giants going. Between the huge fish dwelling beneath the waters of South America's jungles and large mammals like capybara that line the banks of the rivers, anacondas have managed to maintain their body size this entire time. That itself is incredibly fascinating and shows us the same mentality as crocodilian evolution. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. While we're on the topic of giant animals, we've got to talk about the new study on Edmontosaurus. If you're a fan of paleontology, you might have heard the term Edmontosaurus mummy before, most famously from specimens found in the early 1900s by none other than Charles Sternberg. Dinosaur mummies like Sternberg's typically preserve areas we haven't seen before in fossils and usually soft tissue. In this case, it was dinosaur skin. Paleontologist Paul Sereno realized that Sternberg's find wasn't a one-off situation. The locale where they were found has also yielded other dinosaurs with preserved skin and more, including two Edmontosaurus found in the early 2000s by Sereno's team. They dubbed a 10-kilometer area in and around Wyoming as a mummy zone, as it had the perfect conditions for yielding such fossils. These conditions did something unique to those Edmontosaurus. They fossilized through a method dubbed clay templating. These Edmontosaurus likely died through drought during a dry season of sorts. After their death, normal decay would have begun to take place, hollowing out the flesh and muscle inside the animal's corpse. Like all decay, this would have produced bacteria, and in some cases, this bacteria turns into a sort of biofilm that covers the animal's skin, as they described in this study. After the dry season, when the waters returned, the Edmontosaurus were likely buried by a flash flood, and when they were, these hollow portions of their body became filled with sediment. As the dinosaurs became buried, the biofilm on the outside of their body would have attracted clay from the surrounding sediment, forming a mask of material less than a millimeter thick on the animal's skin. From there, the dinosaur became mummified, with the sediment inside also allowing it to fossilize. This thin clay mask preserved incredible details of Edmontosaurus that have never been fully seen before. While we've known for a long time that they had a head crest, its full extent was never revealed. We now know that the crest of Edmontosaurus is not exclusive to its head. While that certainly has the most brazen and out there look compared to the rest of the crest, it also ran from the head down to the midline of its body, similar to dinosaurs like Ouranosaurus, though not nearly as extreme. After passing the hips, this crest forms into a sort of spike row that extends over the majority of the tail. The skin itself of the animal was rather thin compared to what we expected, with wrinkled bunches like some animals have in life. Sereno seems confident this was not due to decay, but that the creatures itself had thin skin. But arguably, one of the most important parts of this find are hooves. Now, that doesn't sound like a huge deal, but outside of mammals, hooves have never been confirmed for any other animal. Yet here, we find them on the hind legs of Edmontosaurus, a bipedal animal at that. Just like mammals, their hooves were covered in keratin. Instead of taking over the entire foot, their hooves covered a majority of each of their toes. Previously, when assuming hadrosaur foot covering, we assumed they were short, tightly packed hooves, if any at all, just barely covering the digit. Now we know the hoof extends quite a ways beyond the toe, though still not to the degree of modern hoofed mammals like horses. The discovery of such an ancient hoofed animal, let alone a hoofed reptile, is one of the most stark cases of convergent evolution I think I've ever seen. Mammals evolved their hooves from more moderately sized ancestors before those groups adapted to having larger forms. On top of that, mammals with hooves are all quadrupedal and have similar limb morphologies for both their forelimbs and hind limbs. Meanwhile, Edmontosaurus is an enormous animal to have hooves at all, along with being bipedal. The team currently believes that the hooves originated in early large hadrosaurids and may have existed as early back as the Jurassic. This whole find is one of the most significant of the year, giving us an incredibly detailed look into the physical appearance of a dinosaur beyond just their fossilized bones, something only a few like Psittacosaurus have ever been able to claim before now. And there was another dinosaur update that I know many folks were incredibly excited to learn. Nanotyrannus, the miniature tyrant lizard itself, is back. Doctors Lindsay Zano and James Napoli have provided incredibly strong evidence separating them from Tyrannosaurus rex, and what's more, creating its own unique genus with two distinct species. However, that study was technically published at the end of October, which means you can find more details about it in the October video for this year's Paleo Rewind by the amazing folks at Geosplore, but we'll still cover all the bases here to understand the new study that happened in December. To understand this, you need a little bit of background. The skull that would first give rise to the name Nanotyrannus was found in the 1940s by paleontologist Charles Gilmore and was thought to belong to Gorgosaurus at the time. Ever since it was first proposed as an individual separate from Tyrannosaurus rex in the 80s by Robert Bakker, there's been a lot of contention around this tiny tyrant. Without getting into the nitty-gritty, the main argument has been whether Nanotyrannus represents its own unique taxon or was simply just a juvenile form of T-Rex. There's been a lot of evidence and claims from both sides. Prior to the October study, the main evidence for Nanotyrannus being its own unique genus was claimed based on morphological traits in their skull and arms. Bakker believed that the original skull was fused, which is a sign of adulthood when an animal finishes growing, but he was rebuked by Thomas Carr, who claimed it was actually an immature animal. Another point from the Nanotyrannus side was the difference in tooth count. Most skulls attributed to Nanotyrannus had 15 to 16 teeth on either side of the upper jaw and 16 to 18 teeth on either side of the lower, as opposed to Rex with 11 to 12 on top and 12 to 13 on bottom. The real problem was that there wasn't enough evidence. Those who argued against Nanotyrannus made a valid point as well. Many of the things used to distinguish Nanotyrannus from a Rex were traits that could be explained by different stages of growth or individual variation. When it came to tooth count, it was shown that other Tyrannosaurids like Gorgosaurus had a reduction in teeth as they aged. What was interpreted as fusion in the skull could be argued as compression of the fossil. The biggest issue and major component against Nanotyrannus for years was the fact that most fossils showed signs of immaturity and weren't definitive adults. The lack of an actual adult Nanotyrannus was its own biggest downfall. When a new study was published in 2024 to try and reassert Nanotyrannus, a huge uproar spread across the scientific community, but one voice made the most sense. Thomas Holtz, one of the world's leading experts on tyrannosaurs, voiced his opinion that neither side could be conclusive until new discoveries were made. The issue was the same. There was not enough evidence to entirely support one side or the other. Both had valid arguments, and up to that point, the evidence seemed to be against Nanotyrannus. Holt said to be conclusive, we would need to find either a young Tyrannosaurus that is definitively a Rex, or a fully mature Nanotyrannus that was relatively complete and definitively not a Rex. Well, we found one. The dueling dinosaurs, a pair of fossils that were obtained by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, was evaluated by Zano and Napoli in an incredibly extensive paper. The paper shows almost definitive proof that Nanotyrannus is a valid genus, and furthermore that it had two unique species. But like I said, if you want more details on that, make sure you check out Geosplore's October video. And now, we found another. The new research from December focuses on the original Nanotyrannus holotype, the skull that was originally thought to belong to Gorgosaurus before the debate began in the 80s. Specifically, it takes a look at the ceratobranchial bone, more commonly known as the hyoid bone. In many modern animals like ostriches, the researchers discovered that the tiny hyoid changed with maturity and could be used on a smaller scale to determine age, similar to larger fossils that show growth rings. With that in mind, as well as the new insight from Napoli and Zano, paleontologist Christopher Griffin took a look at the hyoid bone and was able to show that it revealed that the original holotype is in fact a fully mature Nanotyrannus lancensis. While not as impactful as the October paper, the fact that another confirmed Nanotyrannus exists lends more support to the creature's return. Also, the fact of it being the holotype is significant in reinforcing the resurrection of this creature's name, as otherwise they might have been forced to change the name of the animal. Naming rules are really weird with science, not my fault. This new Nanotyrannus discovery reinforces this amazing creature and could potentially lead to future discoveries of animal maturity using the hyoid bone as an aging method. That itself is nothing short of absolutely brilliant.
This year has been one of the worst on record, for basically everything. Life on Earth is headed into the great dark abyss, and I cannot help but wonder, what was it all for? Oh yeah, that. Anyway, way underneath all the heinous things the worst, most empathyless, soulless monsters we share a species with were doing, the best of us were busy finding, describing, and understanding the way that things are. These bone people, paleontologists, and maybe even some biologists for kicks and giggles, were hard at work doing science for us dum-dums to digest and then add into our worldview. You are likely here, having just watched DinoFax's segment of Paleo Rewind, so that means that after this one, you should come back to this old corpse of a channel to sit through the chaos that is the entire Paleo Rewind compilation. Where is 2024's, you might ask? Well, you see, I tried. I will have it out as soon as I can. Thanks for your patience. Make sure you watch the videos made by all of this year's participants and follow them, assuming you like their content. I can't force you, though I would if I could. Falsascaris. Many of you know of the Burgess Shale, a huge chunk of rock in the Canadian Rockies that preserves things so well that the history of the beginning of complex life forms fell out of it. There are many more sites like this globally, and one of those is the Ordovician-aged Fezuata Formation of Morocco. Most of the fossils that come from this geologic formation preserve carbonized films where the soft tissues of the bodies used to be. Back in the Ordovician, this region was at the poles, so the fossils that come out of it help to better round out what was going on at that part of the world. December saw the publication of a paper describing 7 mouthparts belonging to a group of invertebrates you may not know the name of, but you definitely know the face of: the radiodonts, such as the famous Anomalocaris. These fossils were uncovered by Mohammed Ben Mula and his family from 2009 to 2019, along with a bunch of other fossils. The 7 mouthparts belong to 3 different institutions in Switzerland and the Third World known as the US. The author team that described the remains, which was international and includes names my Western tongue would butcher, found that the mouthparts would have belonged to a rather huge radiodont of 0.7 to 1.2 meters or 2.3 to 4 feet in body length. The researchers described the anatomy of the mouthparts, finding them to be very similar to those seen in other arthropods that rake through the top layer of sediment for their cheeseburgers and fries, making the new creature a benthivore. They named the new animal Falsascaris mumakiana, being composed of falx or scythe, caris for crab or shrimp, and mumak in reference to the giant elephants in The Lord of the Rings. Though the body and head is unknown, the anatomy of the mouthparts are closest to those of the Herdiidae group of radiodonts, which were usually large, boat-shaped, and carried generally smaller mouthparts arranged in a basket-like configuration. That said, Falsascaris had quite large mouthparts. What that mouth do? Trawl for bottom-feeding morsels. Salwa siren. When you think about the fossil record, I bet you don't tend to think of many places within what many outdatedly refer to as the Middle East. This is due to the generally fraught political climate of the region. However, the rock deposits throughout the region are extremely rich in fossil content. Paleontologists from the Smithsonian, some parts of the US, Panama, and Qatar were out in the deserts of the US's corrupt butt buddy looking for the fossilized remains of dugongs, which still hold on in seagrass meadows along the coast. Over the field seasons of 2023 and 2024, the researchers uncovered over 300 fossils belonging to around 6 individuals of a new dugong species from 172 different spots in the Dam Formation, eroding out of Al-Mashabia. With so many remains, they were able to describe the new species as Salwasiren catarensis. Salwasiren was smaller than today's dugongs, with a less bent snout and smaller tusks. Though no seagrass fossils were found in the layers the bones were found in, it's assumed they would have been around since the sediments do prove the area was still shallow coast. Geoduckgeosciences. One of the most unusual turtles with us today is, perhaps unexpectedly, the hog-nosed turtle. This thing is weird mostly because it belongs to its own group separate from the sea turtles, freshwater turtles, and tortoises. It's a Trionychian, meaning it's mostly closely related to a bunch of extinct turtles that were living it up in freshwater and saltwater environments throughout the Cretaceous period and Cenozoic era. December saw the publication of a new species of this type of turtle, members of the Ceratochylidae group, by a bunch of researchers in the Swiss Journal of Paleontology. The turtle, which they named GeoduckGeosciences, comes from the Cretaceous Hosandong Formation of South Korea and is based on a relatively complete specimen preserving much of the shell. It's not particularly unusual, but it does provide some new insight into the evolution of these often overlooked turtles. Bolivian dinosaur tracks. Between 2019 and 2024, a group of American and Bolivian scientists went out into Bolivia's Toro National Park to document a huge field of fossil footprints dating to the Cretaceous. They published their work, which included descriptions of over 16,000 total tracks in +1. All of the tracks were made by theropod dinosaurs, with some matching the anatomy of the feet of giant hyperpredatory forms like Carcharodontosaurs, while others were much smaller and more gracile, akin to ornithomimosaurs and noasaurs. A truly breathtaking place. Tamariaptor and Marischia reevaluation. There are 2 tiny Coelurosaurian theropod dinosaurs known from the soft tissue preserving layers of the Cretaceous-aged Romualdo Formation of Brazil, Tamariaptor and Marischia. Tamariaptor was discovered in the late 1990s and described in 1999. Marischia was found in 2000 and named in 2004. Both are relatively fragmentary, and many paleontologists have wondered if they were the same animal or what they were related to. Raphael Delcourt and colleagues published a paper reevaluating the holotype specimens of these 2 theropods in the anatomical record, finding that they really cannot be comfortably lumped together, though they do share a lot of similarities. So many similarities do they share that this new investigation found them to be each other's closest relatives, along with Duratyrant of Jurassic Europe and Tanicolagrius of Jurassic North America, as some of the earliest branches of the Maniraptoromorpha group, the group which led to the ornithomimosaurs, compsognathids, dromaeosaurs, and birds. Bees and bones. South of the town of Oviedo, in the Pedernales province of the Dominican Republic, lies a cave, Cueva de Mono. In that cave are many fossil and subfossil remains of the weird and wacky birds, mammals, and reptiles that once inhabited the island of Hispaniola throughout the Pleistocene and Holocene epochs. Among the fossils found in Cueva de Mono were the bones of large rodents and sloths, but upon closer inspection, they seemed to have been excavated in a very specific and organized way in some hollowed parts of the jaws. When these bones were CT scanned, the researchers found that the excavations matched the exact size and shape of bee nests. This is the first occurrence of such behavior, and their investigations also found that this species of bee came back to use the bones as nests for generations. Manipulonics. All the way back in 1979, a small, fragmentary theropod dinosaur fossil was recovered from the Cretaceous Nemegt Formation of Mongolia and taken back to the Russian Academy of Sciences, where it stayed pretty much unremarked upon until 2025, when it was CT scanned and beautifully reconstructed by talented paleo artist Andrei Atuchin and described by Alexander Averinov and Alexei Lopatin in the Proceedings of the Zoological Institute RAS as a new species. Manipulonyx reshetovi, a type of dinosaur called an Alvarezsaur. These were usually very small, lightly built animals that bandied about on a pair of long, thin legs with big muscular bases, as well as carrying a pair of teeny tiny arms with robust forearms and giant claws instead of hands. They also had very sophisticated ears, eyes, and brains for seeing in the dark and hearing the minute twitches of teeny tiny prey items. Manipulonyx is known only from some vertebrae from the neck, pelvis, and tail, a tiny chunk of the knee and foot, but most importantly, the shoulder girdle and arms, which preserved the weirdest arms yet known from this group of weird-armed weirdos. Here is the skeletal diagram of the hand. Kind of hard to tell what is going on here. This one looks almost like an actual Swiss Army knife hand. The big thing in the middle is a finger, with those two smaller ones to the sides also fingers. Then you've got what appears to be 3 knobs of keeled bone between the fingers, on the top of the wrist, and on the inside of the hand. These bones are called osteoderms because they are bones that sit underneath the skin, usually with a layer of keratin that goes over the skin and over the bone. So, this is what such a hand might look like in life. A big spiky mitten with a harpoon finger sticking out of it and 2 tiny little stabilizers hanging under it all. Unfortunately, no skull for Manipulonyx, so it cannot be fully confirmed what it was eating, but the researchers think the hand anatomy points somewhat strongly in the direction of oophagy, or egg eating. People are used to the oviraptorosaurs as the egg eaters, but that's a misnomer. The Alvarezsaurs seemed to be better adapted for the job, since most had long skinny snouts, tiny bodies, and small but powerful arms with that big claw. Manipulonyx's hand seems really well adapted to grasping and holding on to a smooth egg and then cracking it with the giant claw. Truly one of the most bizarre beasts.